Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It was just past midnight when the train began its journey, the wheels humming against the track as we sped through the dark countryside. The rhythmic sound of the train, combined with the dim lighting and the quiet of the night, created a strange sense of isolation. The only other passengers in my compartment were an elderly man who had dozed off almost immediately and a young woman reading a book near the window. The train was almost empty, and the silence felt heavy, pressing down on my thoughts. I had boarded the train to escape the weight of the city, seeking solace in the quiet, the steady hum of the engine, and the fleeting lights that blinked by in the dark. But as I sat back in my seat, trying to relax, something felt wrong. It was subtle at first, a strange unease that I couldn't quite place. The air felt thicker than usual, a bit too warm for the coolness of the night. My eyes drifted to the small window beside me, and I caught a fleeting glimpse of something moving just outside. I leaned forward, peering into the darkness, but there was nothing, just the shadowy landscape rushing past. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling. It was probably just the isolation of the night playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. A movement, too quick to be real, flickering at the edge of my vision. I glanced over to the other passengers, but neither of them seemed to have noticed anything unusual. The elderly man was still snoring softly, and the woman remained engrossed in her book. I tried to ignore the feeling, pulling my coat tighter around me, but it persisted. I could feel my heart rate quicken, my mind racing with unease. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the quiet, the stillness, it was something else, something I couldn't quite explain. That's when I saw him. A man stood in the aisle just beyond the compartment, his figure outlined by the dim light of the train. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that looked oddly out of place for the late hour. His face was pale, his features sharp and angular, his expression unreadable. I blinked, thinking it was just the dim light playing tricks on my eyes, but when I looked again, he was still there. I froze. The man didn't move, didn't make a sound. He simply stood there, staring ahead as though he were waiting for something. His presence seemed to fill the space between us, like a weight that pressed on my chest. I wanted to speak, to ask him what he was doing, but the words stuck in my throat. For a moment, I thought I had imagined him. I glanced around the compartment again, but the other passengers remained oblivious to the man's presence. The elderly man hadn't stirred, and the woman still hadn't looked up from her book. But the man was real. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. I took a deep breath, my hand gripping the edge of my seat as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The train rocked slightly, the sound of the wheels humming louder, and I looked back to the aisle, expecting him to be gone. But he wasn't. He was still there. And now, something had changed. The air in the compartment felt colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The flickering light above began to buzz, its glow dimming and then brightening again in quick intervals. The man's eyes were fixed on something, though I couldn't see what it was. His gaze seemed distant, as if he weren't even aware of his surroundings. And then, as if to confirm my growing dread, he began to move. Slowly, silently, he stepped forward, his shoes making no sound on the floor. He walked toward me, his gaze never leaving its fixed point. His features remained expressionless, but I could feel a chill creeping over me, an icy sense of foreboding that tightened around my chest. I was paralyzed, unable to look away as he came closer, closer, until he was standing right in front of my seat. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he raised his hand, extending it toward me. I flinched, my mind racing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if I had been frozen in place, my thoughts unable to break free from the trap of fear that had taken hold of me. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man was gone, vanished into thin air. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest, but the aisle was empty. The air was warmer again, the eerie coldness lifting as though it had never been there at all. The dim light above hummed steadily, and the sound of the train continued to roll on through the night. I looked at the other passengers, half expecting them to have noticed something, but they remained completely unaware of the strange occurrence. The elderly man was still asleep, and the woman still reading. My breath was shallow as I slowly turned back toward the aisle. The man had been real, there was no doubt about it. But now, there was nothing. No trace of his presence. No sign that he had ever been there at all. The train continued its journey through the night, the rhythmic sound of the wheels a constant reminder of the reality I wanted to cling to. But deep down, something had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had been a warning, an omen, perhaps, that there was more to this train ride than I had ever imagined. I glanced at my watch. The time was just a few minutes past 1, but the world outside had already begun to change. The dark sky was beginning to lighten, a faint glow creeping along the horizon as the first hints of dawn began to break. I sighed, the tension in my chest not quite gone, but I told myself it was over. Just a strange dream or hallucination. It had to be. But as the train hummed steadily forward, I couldn't help but glance at the empty seat across from me, wondering if the ghost would return with the dawn. And I had no way of knowing that it would. The train rolled on, its steady rhythm becoming almost hypnotic. I tried to focus on the passing scenery, but the events of the last hour weighed heavily on my mind. The man, or whatever he was, had left no trace, nothing but the cold air and the lingering feeling of dread. I glanced out the window again. The faint glow of dawn was becoming brighter, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. But the unease in my chest remained, a constant presence gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. As I sat there, lost in my own thoughts, I suddenly heard a noise. A soft tapping, almost imperceptible at first, coming from the compartment door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Could it be him? No, it couldn't be. I had to be imagining things. But the sound continued, growing slightly louder with each passing second. I turned toward the door, my eyes narrowing. The tapping had stopped, but I could feel a presence just beyond the thin, frosted glass. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just the wind? A stray sound from another part of the train? Or was it something else? I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling slightly, but before I could open it, I heard a voice. It was faint, almost drowned out by the hum of the train, but it was unmistakable. Are you going to let me in? I froze again, my blood turning to ice. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something unnerving about it. Something wrong. I didn't answer. Instead, I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice sounded familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, but I couldn't place it. I waited, holding my breath, the seconds stretching into what felt like eternity. The voice spoke again, this time clearer, more insistent. I won't bite, I promise. The door handle turned just slightly, as if the person on the other side were testing it. My mind raced. Should I open it? Should I call for help? But the compartment was still empty. The elderly man was still asleep, and the woman had moved from her seat. There was no one else around to help. I reached for the handle, the cold metal sending a shiver through my fingers. But before I could twist it, the voice was gone. Just gone. The silence returned, heavier than ever, pressing down on me with its unnatural weight. I hesitated, my hand still gripping the handle. I was torn between fear and curiosity, my heart pounding in my ears. What was going on? Who was that? I turned back toward my seat, glancing nervously around the compartment. The air felt thick, as if the very atmosphere of the train had changed. The walls seemed closer, the light dimmer. I had to do something. I had to make sense of this. But when I looked out the window again, I saw him. The man. The one from before. He was standing on the platform, his face hidden in shadow, but his outline unmistakable. He was watching the train, his cold eyes fixed on the window where I sat. I couldn't look away, my gaze locked with his as the train sped through the night. The man never moved, but his presence was undeniable, like a part of the darkness itself. Then, just as before, he disappeared. One moment he was there, and the next, nothing. It was as if the very night itself had swallowed him whole. My chest tightened. The unease in my stomach had grown into something far worse, a deep, gnawing fear that refused to leave. This couldn't be happening. It just couldn't. I tried to push the thought from my mind. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I had imagined it all. I tried to relax, tried to focus on the mundane things, the soft hum of the train, the motion beneath me, but it was no use. My heart kept racing, my eyes kept darting to the door, the window, the dark corners of the compartment. And then I heard it again. The tapping. Louder now, more urgent, as if something, or someone, was trying to get in. The door shook slightly with each knock, and I could feel the temperature drop in the compartment. It wasn't the cold of the outside air, it was a chill, the kind that crept into your bones and made you feel like you were being watched. I stood up, my knees shaky, my body instinctively moving toward the door. I reached for the handle again, but before I could twist it, the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that shook the entire compartment. I staggered back in shock. Standing in the doorway was the man, his face pale, his eyes cold and empty, like twin voids. His mouth was slightly open, as if he had been speaking, but no sound came out. His figure was blurry, as if he were made of smoke, barely solid enough to hold together. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt frozen to the floor. I couldn't move. The man's eyes locked onto mine, and I saw something there, something ancient, something terrifying that I couldn't comprehend. His mouth moved again, but this time the words were clear. "You shouldn't have looked back," he said, his voice low and rasping. "Now you'll see the truth." And with that, he stepped forward. The train lurched. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the compartment into darkness. The last thing I heard before everything went silent was the soft whisper of footsteps retreating into the dark, echoing through the void. The darkness was suffocating. My breath came in short, frantic gasps, my pulse pounding in my ears. I tried to steady myself, but the overwhelming sense of dread made it impossible to think clearly. The train was still moving, but now it felt like we were trapped in a void. Nothing beyond the walls of the compartment existed. No outside world. No destination. Just this suffocating, unyielding silence. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The screen flickered to life as I held it close, casting a dim light around me. But it did little to push back the darkness. I could still feel the presence, the cold weight of someone or something watching me. A distant rumble echoed through the train, then a sudden jolt made me stumble forward. I barely caught myself on the edge of the seat. My heart was pounding harder now, and I could taste the fear on the back of my throat. Was it the man? Had he left? Was it over? I swallowed hard, trying to silence the growing panic inside me. I couldn't stay in the compartment. I had to get out, get away from whatever was happening. But just as I reached for the door, I heard it again, the faint tapping. It was coming from the window this time. Soft, almost imperceptible, like fingernails brushing against glass. I froze. My hand hovered over the door handle, but my body refused to move. My eyes locked onto the window, where the tapping continued, growing louder. But there was no one outside. Nothing but the vast emptiness of the night. Then, slowly, the silhouette appeared. The same man. His face was still obscured in shadow, his eyes reflecting the pale glow of the phone screen. He stood motionless outside the window, his figure just barely visible through the thick fog that had settled around the train. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away. He was there. I had seen him in the compartment, and now he was outside, staring at me with those same empty eyes. The tapping stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard a low, guttural sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the train's engine. It was something else, something that felt far too close, far too personal. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding harder than before. I knew I had to do something, but fear rooted me in place. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead. And then the train lurched again, this time with a force that almost sent me flying into the seat. The lights flickered once more, the screen on my phone dimming as the power seemed to wane. The eerie hum of the train's wheels against the tracks grew louder, and the temperature dropped even further. My breath was now visible, swirling in the air in front of me. The man, he was still outside the window. But this time, something was different. His form seemed to stretch unnaturally, distorting like a shadow cast on the wrong surface. The longer I stared, the more his face twisted, as though reality itself couldn't hold him together. I had to look away. I turned to face the compartment door again, but this time it was open. The cold, musty air rushed in, and I saw a shape standing in the doorway. Not the man from before, no, this figure was different. Taller. More imposing. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else entirely. Its presence was overwhelming. My legs finally found the strength to move, and I backed away, pressing my back against the opposite wall. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, blocking my escape. My mind raced. Should I try to push past it? Should I scream? But the fear kept me paralyzed, locked in place, unable to act. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant hiss of steam and the creaking of the train's joints. And then, finally, the figure spoke. "You're still here?" Its voice was deep and unsettling, barely human. I could feel it vibrating in my bones, as if the sound itself were alive. I swallowed, my throat dry. What do you want?" I managed to whisper, though the words barely escaped my lips. The figure's head tilted, and I could feel its eyes, if it had eyes, on me. The presence seemed to grow stronger, filling every corner of the compartment. "You look back," the voice said again, a dark echo that seemed to reverberate through the train. "Now you see the truth." Before I could respond, the figure lunged forward, its limbs unnaturally long, reaching for me. My body reacted instinctively, screaming, stumbling back, trying to escape, but there was nowhere to go. I collided with the wall, the cold surface biting into my skin as I slid to the floor, my heart racing uncontrollably. The figure was so close now, so near I could feel the chill of its breath, the cold that seemed to emanate from its very being. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The train lurched again, its motion becoming erratic as though the tracks themselves were shaking beneath us. The lights flickered and died completely, leaving me in total darkness. The only sound now was the shrill, high-pitched whistling of the train's brakes, the rush of air as it screeched to a stop. I held my breath. Had it all been a dream? Had I imagined everything? But as the world around me grew still, I heard it again, faintly, almost imperceptibly, a whisper. "You're still here." And that was when I knew. I wasn't alone anymore. The silence that followed was unbearable. The train was completely still now, almost as though it had never moved at all. The only sound that broke the stillness was my breathing, shallow, panicked breaths, each one sharper than the last. My phone, still clutched in my trembling hand, flickered back to life for a moment before going black again. The glow of the screen had been my only comfort, but now even that had betrayed me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was I dreaming? Was I losing my mind? The figure, the voice, the man outside the window, had it all been some kind of hallucination? I slowly opened my eyes, cautiously scanning the compartment. It was just as I had left it. Nothing had changed. The seat opposite me was still empty. The door was still ajar. There was no sign of the strange figure, no trace of the man outside the window. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. Suddenly, the train lurched back to life. The screech of metal on metal pierced the air, and the dim, flickering lights came back on. My heart skipped a beat, the jarring motion throwing me forward. I gripped the seat in front of me, trying to steady myself, but the tremors in my hands made it impossible to focus. The train began to move again, its wheels creaking along the tracks with an eerie, unnatural rhythm. It wasn't the steady, comforting hum of the train's engine I had grown used to. This was different, almost like it was dragging itself forward, unwillingly, against its own will. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just fatigue, maybe stress. I had been on this journey for hours, too long, perhaps. The lack of sleep, the isolation, the claustrophobia of the compartment, it was playing tricks on me. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the cold sense of unease that clung to my every thought. The figure, the whisper, it wasn't normal. None of it was. The lights flickered again, and then something strange happened. A loud bang sounded from somewhere further down the train, followed by a low, dragging sound. It was coming closer, steadily, and I could hear the faint scraping of metal against the floor, as though someone, or something, was dragging something heavy behind it. I froze, straining my ears, trying to locate the source of the noise. It was moving down the hall, growing louder with each passing second. It was closer now. I could feel the vibrations through the floor, like the train was shaking under the weight of whatever it was. Then, Just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. My pulse raced, every part of me on edge. I slowly stood up, heart hammering in my chest. The door was still open, and I could hear the wind whistling softly outside. I knew I had to leave the compartment. I had to escape before whatever it was found me. But just as I moved toward the door, the lights went out again, this time, completely. The train was now plunged into total darkness, the only sound my ragged breathing. The cold air rushed in from the open door, chilling me to the bone. A low chuckle echoed through the compartment. It wasn't a laugh. It was something darker, an inhuman sound, something that made my skin crawl. It came from the far corner of the compartment, near the window. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the compartment, just beyond the edge of my vision. It was the same man. His face was still a blur in the shadows, but I could see the glint of his eyes, empty, cold, and utterly lifeless. His body seemed to shimmer, flickering in and out of focus, as though he were fading in and out of existence. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. "You're still here," the voice whispered again, but this time it was different. It was inside my head, inside my thoughts. It was all around me. "Do you remember me?" the voice asked. It was distant now, as though it were coming from everywhere at once. I tried to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The figure took a step forward, and with that step, the air grew colder, colder than I had ever felt before. It was as if the temperature had dropped to absolute zero. My breath came in clouds, but they didn't dissipate. They hung in the air like smoke, thickening with every second. The man smiled, though his mouth never moved. The corners of his face twitched, as if a grimace had taken hold of him, but it was no smile. His form was fading, and with each blink, he was becoming more and more translucent. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him, even as my body screamed for escape. He was standing in front of me now, so close that I could feel the cold radiating from him, seeping into my bones. "I've been waiting," he whispered, his voice distorted. "Waiting for you to realize." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. And then, with a final, sickening shudder, the figure vanished completely. The air warmed instantly, the train's lights flickering back to life, though now they were dim and weak. I was left standing in the middle of the compartment, shaking uncontrollably, my heart racing in my chest. And then, just as I thought it was over, I heard one final whisper, faint but clear. "You're not alone." The train continued its journey, the tracks stretching on into the endless night. But I knew I would never be alone again. I had always been a creature of habit. I liked things to be predictable, to have a certain rhythm that I could rely on. So when I found this small apartment on the outskirts of the city, I thought I had stumbled upon the perfect place. It was cheap, simple, and in an area that wasn't too busy. Most importantly, it was available right away, and I needed a place to stay. The landlord, an elderly man with a hunchback and a perpetually tired look in his eyes, seemed eager to rent out the space. He didn't ask for much, just a signed lease and a modest deposit. No background checks, no questions about my past. He simply handed me the keys with a small, almost imperceptible smile, as though he were relieved to be rid of it. The apartment itself was small, but cozy enough for a single person. One bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area that had just enough space for a couch and a coffee table. The walls were a dull beige, the carpet a bit worn in places, but overall, it felt like a place I could call home, at least for a while. At first, everything was normal. I moved in, unpacked my things, and settled into the routine of daily life. The sounds of the city outside were distant, and the quiet of the apartment gave me the peace I had been searching for. I spent my evenings reading, cooking simple meals, and listening to music. Nothing remarkable happened. It was exactly what I needed. But then, it started. The whispering. It began one night, around the same time every evening. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I would hear it. Soft at first, like a distant murmur that I could almost convince myself was the wind. But it wasn't the wind. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, the sound grew louder and clearer as the nights went on. At first, it seemed like it was coming from the walls. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to discern the words. Sometimes, it sounded like a conversation, but always muffled, as though the speakers were hidden just beyond my reach. Other times, it was a single voice, a low whisper, repeating the same things over and over. The first night I heard it, I assumed I had imagined it. I was tired, stressed from work, and maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But the whispering didn't stop. It became a nightly ritual, the same faint sounds drifting through the walls, the same time every night. I began to dread going to bed, knowing the noise would follow me into sleep. I tried everything to ignore it. I turned on the TV, played music loud enough to drown it out, but nothing worked. The whispering was always there, lurking in the background, like a constant reminder that something was wrong with the apartment. I even considered asking the landlord about it, but each time I saw him, he seemed distant, almost like he was trying to avoid me. And then, there were the dreams. Every time I slept, the dreams grew more vivid, more unsettling. I dreamed of dark figures standing at the foot of my bed, their faces obscured, their bodies hidden in shadows. They would watch me, but never move. The whispers in my dreams were the same as the ones from the walls, cryptic, unintelligible, but somehow urgent. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, my skin cold. The room always felt colder when I woke up, as though the temperature had dropped by several degrees. The whispers were never the same. Some nights, they were just words, barely audible. Other nights, they were clearer, more distinct. I could almost make out phrases like help or leave, but they were always followed by that chilling silence, as if whoever was speaking didn't want to be heard. It was getting to the point where I was afraid to be alone in the apartment. I would try to spend more time outside, in the coffee shops or walking around the neighborhood, just to avoid being there when night fell. But sooner or later, I always had to return, and when I did, the apartment was always the same, quiet, still, and waiting for me. One night, I finally decided to confront the noise. I had enough. I needed to know what was causing it, and I wasn't going to let some whispers control my life. I waited until the sun set, and the familiar chill began to settle over the room. The whispering started like clockwork. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, trying to make sense of the words. This time, it was different. The voice didn't sound like it was coming from the walls anymore. It was closer, much closer. The whispers now seemed to be right next to me, as though someone was standing just outside my door, whispering my name. The words were clearer than they had ever been. "Come closer," it said. "We're waiting for you." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. I wanted to call out, to demand answers, but my voice caught in my throat. The silence that followed was suffocating. The room felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls were closing in around me. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway just outside my door. I was no longer alone. The footsteps. They stopped right outside my door. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on me from every side. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat, suffocated by a growing sense of dread. I waited. Each second felt like an eternity, the silence stretching into the abyss. The whispering had stopped, but I could still hear the faintest echo of footsteps, as if they were waiting for me to make the first move. I lay there in the dark, unable to even look at the door. My mind raced. Was someone really out there? Had I somehow imagined it all? I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers trembling as I fumbled for it in the dark. I turned on the screen and checked the time, just past midnight. I had no idea what to do. The footsteps resumed. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. They came closer, and I could hear them stop just on the other side of the door. A long pause. And then, the softest sound, like someone exhaling. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to will myself to believe this was all just a trick of my imagination. But my pulse raced, my breathing shallow. There was something wrong. Something I couldn't explain, but that I could feel deep in my bones. I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I was terrified. The door to my bedroom, which I had left closed but not locked, creaked. My stomach dropped. I didn't move a muscle, holding my breath, as if that might somehow make me invisible to whatever, or whoever, was out there. I knew I should have turned on the light, gotten up, checked the hallway, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The idea of standing up and walking into that darkness felt impossible, like an invisible force was keeping me glued to the bed. All I could do was listen to the sound of slow, steady breathing coming from just outside the door. My mind raced with questions. Who was out there? Was it the landlord, playing some twisted prank? Was there someone else living in the building, someone I had never seen before? Or was this something else entirely? Something far worse? A soft knock broke the silence. I froze. The knock wasn't loud, but it wasn't soft either. It was deliberate. It was as if whoever was out there wanted me to hear it. I didn't respond. The thought of answering the door made my skin crawl. What if it wasn't the landlord? What if it was something else? The knock came again, this time louder. 3 knocks, one after the other. And then, a voice. Let me in. The voice was faint, strained, as if it was being whispered through a thick wall. I strained to hear it, but the words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp fully. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Should I open the door? Should I scream for help? But I knew deep down that even if I screamed, no one would hear me. No one would come. The voice came again, but this time it was closer. So close, it felt as though it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. Let me in, it repeated, softer now. A plea. I could feel the presence in the room with me, just out of sight. My skin crawled, and I finally gathered enough courage to turn my head toward the door. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, stretching out as if the darkness itself was alive, moving toward me. The temperature dropped several degrees, and I shivered involuntarily. I had to know. I had to see what was out there, what had been watching me all this time. Slowly, carefully, I inched toward the door. My hand trembled as it reached for the doorknob. Just as I touched it, the door flew open on its own. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. The hallway outside was empty. But it wasn't completely dark, not like the room. There was a faint light at the end of the corridor, casting long shadows along the floor. I could hear the faint hum of the building's ancient wiring, but nothing else. No footsteps, no breathing. I stepped into the hallway cautiously, my eyes scanning every corner. But there was no one. No figure standing in the shadows. No one at all. Just the empty, silent corridor stretching out in front of me. Confused and shaken, I slowly stepped back into my room, the door closing softly behind me. The whispering started again, faint at first but growing louder, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me, suffocating me. I collapsed onto the bed, my hands clutching the blankets, trying to steady myself. Was I losing my mind? Had I imagined the whole thing? The whispering became clearer now. Words. Phrases. I can hear you. I'm here. Come closer. It was no longer just whispers. It was a voice, a single, insistent voice that seemed to wrap around me, trapping me. I could feel it in my chest, in my throat, in my very bones. And then, the sound of footsteps again. This time, there was no mistaking it. They were inside the room with me. Coming closer. Moving slowly, purposefully. I was not alone anymore. The footsteps grew louder with each passing second. My heart raced, and my breath became shallow. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. I was paralyzed, frozen beneath the weight of an unseen presence moving closer and closer. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was all in my head. The whispering, the footsteps, the cold that had settled in the room like a blanket of ice. It couldn't be real, but I felt it. I could feel it in my chest, the steady rhythm of something or someone moving around me. I tried to gather my thoughts. There had to be an explanation. This couldn't be happening. I was in a new place, an unfamiliar place. Maybe the old building had creaky pipes, maybe there was an animal in the walls, but there was no way the footsteps were real. No way the voice was real. But then I heard it again, unmistakable. Come closer. The voice was clearer now, more distinct. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a command, a demand that made my skin crawl. It was close. Too close. The air in the room felt thick with tension, as if the space itself was holding its breath. I turned my head toward the source of the sound. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, a presence just beyond the corner of my vision, like something lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to look away. My pulse raced as I slowly, carefully, pushed myself up from the bed. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then resumed, but now they weren't just outside the room, they were inside, moving across the floor, circling me. I gripped the edge of the bed, trying to steady myself, but my hands were slick with sweat. My feet felt heavy as I took one cautious step toward the door. The whispering had become a chant now, a low hum that seemed to echo from the walls, from the very space around me. It wasn't coming from any one place, it was coming from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was everywhere. I reached the door, my fingers brushing the doorknob, but before I could turn it, the whispering stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Too silent. My ears rang with the absence of sound, and my heartbeat thudded in my chest. I stood still, waiting, listening. I knew that whatever it was watching me. It was waiting for me to make the next move. Then, suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The force of it sent me stumbling backward, crashing into the bed. I gasped, heart racing, as the room filled with a cold, oppressive air. I could hear something else now. Something moving, sliding across the floor, like fingers scraping against the surface. I turned toward the sound, but again, there was nothing. I was losing my mind. That's all it could be. There had to be some logical explanation. The house was old, the building was settling, the wind was making strange noises, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I sat there in the dark, alone in the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I could feel it pressing in on me, could feel it watching me, waiting for me to give in to my fear. And then, I heard it. A voice, so close now, I could feel its breath against my ear. "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a chill down my spine. They were no longer whispers, they were a command, spoken with a clarity that sent a wave of terror through me. The voice didn't sound human. It was wrong, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside the walls. I scrambled to my feet, looking around the room for an escape, but there was nothing. No window to open, no door to run through. I was trapped. The air was thick with something I couldn't describe, but it felt as if the very walls of the room were closing in on me, suffocating me. The whispers started again, louder this time, louder and more insistent, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. The words were indecipherable, a jumble of sounds that made no sense, but they were growing louder, and the air in the room grew colder. And then, I saw it. A figure, standing in the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, as if it were made of shadows itself. Its face, if you could call it a face, was hollow, featureless, just a dark void, an empty space where a person's face should have been. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stared at it, paralyzed by the horror of it all. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. And then, as if on cue, it stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately. Each step seemed to make the darkness around it grow thicker, darker. It was coming closer, closer, until it was right in front of me, towering over me, blocking out all the light in the room. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my mouth a desert. My vision blurred, and everything around me began to spin, the shadows swirling, as if the room itself was alive, twisting and warping under the weight of whatever this thing was. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was silent again. Still. Empty. I stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to think. My chest heaved with panic, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't understand what had just happened. What was that thing? Why had it been here? Was it still here? The question echoed in my mind, and I realized, with a sickening certainty, that I was never going to get an answer. Not unless I stayed. Not unless I stayed here, in this cursed room, where the whispers never stopped and the shadows never faded. I knew I couldn't leave. Not now. Not after what I had seen. The silence was oppressive, smothering. It felt like I was suffocating in this place, like the walls were closing in with every passing second. The shadow, the figure, had vanished, but it left something behind, something I couldn't explain. A sense of dread that clung to me, filling my lungs with ice-cold air. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the darkness, but time seemed to stretch and bend. Minutes felt like hours, hours like seconds. The only thing I could focus on was the cold, the unnatural chill that had taken hold of my skin, creeping under my clothes and sinking into my bones. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was deafening. The room felt too still, too empty, like it was waiting for something. Waiting for me to move, to make the next mistake. I had to leave. I knew that. My body screamed for escape, for fresh air, for daylight, for anything other than the suffocating atmosphere of this room. But my legs refused to move. They felt like stone, heavy and unresponsive, as if the room itself was holding me in place. The figure, whatever it was still here. I could feel it in the air. It was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for me to do something that would break the fragile peace of this place. Suddenly, I heard a noise. At first, it was so faint, I thought I had imagined it. A soft scrape, like nails on wood, coming from the wall near the bed. I turned toward the sound, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just a wall. Just the same peeling wallpaper, the same cracks in the plaster. Nothing. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But then I heard it again, louder this time. A scratching, like something, or someone, was trying to get out from inside the wall. I stepped forward, drawn to the sound despite every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. My hand reached for the wall, trembling as my fingers brushed against the rough surface. I leaned in closer, straining to hear. And then, in the deepest part of the wall, I heard it clearly. A voice. Soft. Faint. Almost a whisper. Help me. The words were so quiet, I almost didn't catch them, but they were unmistakable. A voice, muffled by the walls, begging for help. My stomach churned, and my breath caught in my throat. Help me, the voice repeated, clearer now, more urgent. I pulled my hand away from the wall, stepping back, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. It had to be my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation and fear getting to me. But the voice kept coming. It was coming from the wall. Coming from inside the room. Help me. I stumbled back, my feet slipping on the floor, and I fell hard against the bed. The whispers had started again, low and guttural, filling the room with a noise that seemed to come from every direction. The room itself felt alive, alive with something dark, something that wanted to drag me into its depths. I had to get out. Now. I didn't care about the rent, about the apartment, about anything anymore. I just needed to escape this place, to breathe, to feel sunlight on my skin again. I couldn't stay here. I rushed toward the door, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the doorknob. It wouldn't turn. The lock was jammed, stuck, as if the door itself had decided that I wasn't going anywhere. Help me. The voice was louder now, desperate, coming from within the wall itself. I pressed my ear against the cold surface, my hands slick with sweat, trying to make sense of it, but there was no sense to make. It was like I was hearing a cry from somewhere deep inside the earth, somewhere that shouldn't exist. I backed away from the wall, panic rising in my chest. I had to break out. I couldn't let the darkness in this place swallow me whole. I looked around, searching for anything that could help me. The window. Yes, the window. The room had one small, narrow window, covered by heavy curtains. I rushed over, my fingers pulling at the fabric. It was locked too. I looked down at the floor, at the carpet that covered the entire room. There was nothing, no furniture, no way to pry open the window or break the glass. But then I saw it. In the corner of the room, near the edge of the floor, the carpet was slightly lifted, as though something had been hidden underneath it. My breath hitched. I bent down, my fingers trembling as I lifted the corner of the carpet. There was a trapdoor. A small, wooden door set into the floor, with rusted hinges and a faint smell of dampness. It looked ancient, out of place, like it hadn't been opened in years, maybe decades. I froze, my hand hovering just above the door. What if this was the answer? What if whatever was beneath the floor was the key to the madness in this room? But at the same time, what if it was worse? What if it was the source of everything, the whispers, the shadows, the figure? What if opening that door was the final mistake that would drag me into whatever nightmare this place had become? I hesitated, my heart thudding in my chest. And then, I heard it again. Help me. The voice came from beneath the floor now, clearer, louder, and full of terror. It was a cry that sent a wave of fear through my veins. I had no choice. I had to know what was happening here. I had to understand. I dropped to my knees, my hands trembling as I pulled open the trapdoor. The trapdoor creaked open with a sound that seemed far too loud in the oppressive silence of the room. My pulse raced as I stared down into the darkness below. I couldn't see anything, just a black void that swallowed up the light. My mind screamed at me to close the door, to run, to forget that I ever stepped foot in this cursed place. But the voice, the desperate, frantic voice that had been calling from the walls, from the darkness, something about it kept me rooted to the spot. I needed to know what was down there. I needed to understand what was happening to me, to this place, to the strange whispers that had haunted me since the moment I first stepped inside. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and pointed it into the abyss. The beam of light trembled in my hand as I lowered it into the hole. For a moment, I saw nothing, just the dark, the swirling shadows beneath the floor. Then, a movement. Something shifted in the darkness below. Something I couldn't fully see. I leaned forward, my breath shallow, barely daring to blink. And then, there it was. A pair of eyes, gleaming in the darkness, staring up at me. I recoiled in shock, my heart leaping in my throat. They were human eyes, wide and bloodshot, filled with an inhuman terror. But the figure to which they belonged was not human. The body beneath the floor was twisted, skeletal, pale skin stretched tight over ribs that were visible through the ragged clothing. It looked like someone had been trapped down there, buried in the earth beneath the apartment for how long? Decades? Centuries? The figure's lips moved slowly, painfully, as if it were struggling to speak. Help me. The voice was hoarse, weak, but unmistakable. It was the same voice I had heard from the walls. The same whisper that had sent chills through me every night. And now it was here, in front of me, a twisted and broken reflection of whatever had been haunting me. I should have run. I should have slammed the trapdoor shut and never looked back. But my feet were frozen. My hands were shaking too badly to pull away. The eyes locked onto mine, and suddenly, I felt it. A pull. A cold, invisible force that seemed to reach out from the hole, wrapping itself around me. It wasn't just a physical sensation, it was as if the figure's presence was digging into my very soul, drawing me closer to the depths. Help me! Help me! I could feel the air growing colder, the darkness below growing deeper. The walls around me seemed to close in, the room stretching impossibly narrow. I wanted to scream, to shout, to beg for someone to save me, but I couldn't make a sound. The figure's gaze was too intense, too consuming. I felt my body move on its own, inching closer to the trapdoor. My hands reached down, as if drawn by some unseen force, wanting to touch the figure that lay beneath. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. My mind was playing tricks on me, trying to convince me that this was just another nightmare, another hallucination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had opened the door to something I should never have touched, and now it was too late. The whispering in the room grew louder. It wasn't just the figure anymore, it was everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air itself seemed to pulse with an unholy rhythm, a whispering chorus of voices that echoed in my skull. I tried to pull away, but my legs refused to obey. My fingers brushed against the dark, cold earth beneath the floor, and the sensation was like nothing I had ever felt before. It was wrong. It felt like I was touching something that wasn't meant to exist. Suddenly, the figure below let out a horrible scream, a guttural, inhuman wail that shook the walls and rattled my bones. I staggered back, but it was too late. The room lurched violently, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath me. The force of it knocked me off balance, sending me crashing into the walls. The figure's eyes still burned into me, and its voice, distorted and frantic, filled the room. Help me, you have to help. I screamed, finally breaking the silence, but my voice was swallowed by the abyss. The air in the room became thick, heavy, like I was breathing water. My chest felt tight, my throat raw, but I couldn't breathe. My body felt like it was being pulled down into the trapdoor, into the darkness that lay beneath the floor. The last thing I saw before the world went black was the figure's face, its eyes still locked on mine, its mouth stretched in an agonizing grin. When I woke, I was lying on the floor of the apartment, the trapdoor closed once more. The room was completely silent, unnaturally still. I gasped, sitting up and looking around, my body drenched in cold sweat. The apartment was normal. The whispers were gone. The shadows seemed to have receded, and there was no sign of the figure. It was as if it had never been there at all. But deep down, I knew it had been real. I had felt it. I had heard it. I had touched it. I stood up, my legs shaking, my mind racing, and I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave. As I moved toward the door, I noticed something strange. The walls, where the whispers had come from, were covered in fresh cracks. And from those cracks, a faint, muffled sound began to rise. Help me. And for the first time, I realized it wasn't the figure beneath the floor anymore. It was me. It was a calm morning when I first arrived at the beach. The sky stretched endlessly above, pale blue with just a few clouds scattered across. The waves gently kissed the shore, the soft whoosh of the water mixing with the distant call of seagulls. It was the kind of day that invited you to let your guard down, to relax. But something, an inexplicable sense of unease, settled into my chest the moment I stepped onto the sand. I had come to the beach alone, hoping to find peace and some time to think. The kind of escape that only the ocean can provide. My feet sank slightly into the wet sand as I walked along the shoreline, the coolness of the sea air brushing against my skin. It felt like a perfect day to be alone, far from the noise of the city, to forget about everything for a while. But then, I noticed something unusual. There was a bag, lying abandoned a few meters away from where I stood. It was a simple canvas bag, faded with age, its straps half buried in the sand. No one else was around. I glanced up and down the beach, but it was as empty as ever. The kind of solitude that was almost too quiet, as if the world had paused just for me. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Just some forgotten property left behind by a careless tourist. But as I walked closer, something about the bag felt wrong. It wasn't the fact that it was abandoned, it was the way it sat there, perfectly still, as if waiting for someone to come back for it. I hesitated, my curiosity tugging at me, but I didn't want to invade someone's privacy. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the bag had a story to tell. I knelt down beside it and gently pulled it from the sand. It wasn't heavy, but as I opened it, a strange sensation washed over me, like I was crossing an invisible line into something that didn't belong. Inside the bag, there were a few personal items, a weathered journal, a half-empty water bottle, and a pair of sunglasses. Nothing too alarming, just the usual trinkets you'd expect to find on a day at the beach. But the journal caught my attention. Its leather cover was scratched, as though it had been dragged across the sand. I opened it slowly, my fingers brushing against the pages, and began to read. The writing was neat, but there was something off about it. There were no names, no identifying marks. Just a string of thoughts, mostly about the beach. The author seemed obsessed with the place, writing about its every detail, describing how it changed with the tides, how the colors of the sky shifted as the day went on. The last entry was dated just the day before. The words were jumbled, rushed, as though the person had been in a hurry, but the final sentence stuck with me. I think someone is watching me. I froze. It was nothing more than a random thought, probably. A fleeting fear, nothing more. But as I closed the journal and looked around once more, I felt the tension in the air, like a storm brewing on the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of waves crashing harder against the rocks. I didn't know it yet, but this was the moment the beach had started to change. What I had thought was a peaceful, solitary place was beginning to feel suffocating, as if the sands themselves were hiding something that had been left behind. Something that was waiting. The wind continued to pick up, making the ocean sound more intense, more restless. I stood there for a moment, holding the journal in my hands, staring out at the horizon. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the bag or the eerie feeling that had settled over me. It was everything, how empty the beach was, how silent it had become. I glanced down at the journal again, my fingers tracing the rough edges of the pages. I think someone is watching me, the words repeated in my mind. The sentence wouldn't leave me. I shoved the journal back into the bag, a rush of discomfort growing within me. I tried to tell myself it was just the paranoia of being alone in an unfamiliar place, but a part of me didn't believe that. I felt observed. A chill ran down my spine, and I instinctively looked over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the same empty stretch of beach. I began to walk along the shore again, this time a little faster, my feet leaving deep prints in the wet sand. The wind picked up, tugging at my clothes, and for a moment I thought I heard something faint, like footsteps behind me. I stopped. The sound stopped too. I stood frozen for a moment, straining to hear. The only noise now was the wind and the waves. No footsteps. I must have imagined it. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I decided to keep moving, to push through the anxiety that was creeping in. After all, it was just a bag. Just some random abandoned belongings. Maybe the person who owned it had just gone for a swim or left to grab something from their car. They'd be back any moment. But with each step, the feeling grew stronger. I was being followed. I wasn't sure how I knew it, but the sensation was undeniable. The sounds around me began to shift too. The waves seemed louder, more forceful, and the seagulls' calls were sharper, more frantic, like they were trying to warn me about something. I couldn't shake the feeling that the beach itself had turned against me. I decided to go back to the bag. Maybe there was something more in it that could explain the strange events. As I walked back, I noticed the beach was even quieter now. The usual sounds, the breeze, the birds, had all faded into a kind of muffled hush. It felt as though the entire world was holding its breath. When I reached the spot where I had found the bag, I stopped. My heart skipped a beat. The bag was gone. I blinked, thinking I must have imagined it. I had just left it here, right by the water's edge. But now, it was nowhere in sight. The sand around me was undisturbed. No prints. No evidence that it had ever been there. It was as though the bag had vanished completely, like it had never existed at all. My mind raced. Had I moved it and forgotten? Had someone else taken it? Or was this some trick of the mind, the kind of thing that happens when you start to get too paranoid? I searched the beach, my gaze darting from one side to the other. There was nothing. Just the empty, silent stretch of sand. Then, I heard it. A soft rustling sound coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around quickly, but again, there was nothing there. The sound stopped as soon as I turned. I felt a knot form in my stomach. That wasn't just the wind. That wasn't a bird or the ocean. That sound was deliberate. Someone, or something, was here with me. I took a few cautious steps backward, my eyes scanning the horizon, but everything seemed unchanged. I was still alone. Still on the beach. But the atmosphere had shifted. The calm had turned into something darker, something dangerous. I needed to leave. The walk back to the parking lot should have been simple, just a short stroll down the path through the dunes, but I found myself moving faster now, as if the beach itself was urging me to hurry. My feet were nearly running now, my breath short, and the thought of the journal, the words about someone watching, kept circling in my mind. I reached the path and didn't look back. The sounds of the waves faded as I made my way toward the car, but the sense of dread followed me like a shadow. Every crack of a twig, every gust of wind made me jump. Every distant noise felt like it was coming closer. I was almost at the car when I heard it again. Footsteps. Not far behind me. This time, I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove off, my heart pounding in my chest. The road was empty, and as I glanced in the rearview mirror, all I saw was the open stretch of road behind me. No one. But the feeling of being watched never left. And when I got home, I found the journal on the passenger seat, the pages flicking open as if it had been read. The last entry was different this time. I'm not alone anymore. I couldn't breathe. The words seemed to stare back at me, as though they knew something I didn't. Something far more terrifying. The drive back from the beach should have been a relief, a moment of calm after the unsettling events. But as I turned the key to my front door and stepped inside, I felt a sense of dread wash over me again, just like I had when I first saw the bag on the beach. The journal on my passenger seat with that chilling final entry made my hands tremble. I had thought the beach was behind me, but somehow it had followed me home. I set the journal on the kitchen counter, my mind racing. How had it ended up in my car? I was sure I had left it on the sand next to the bag. There was no explanation, no reason for it to be there. It was as though the journal had somehow chosen to come with me. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe I had forgotten it in my haste to leave. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something far more unsettling at work here, something beyond logic. As I moved through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt thick, the shadows longer than they should be. Every sound, a creak of the floorboards, the wind brushing against the windows, felt amplified, like the house itself was alive and waiting for something. I went to the living room, but when I turned on the light, I froze. The curtains were slightly parted, the dark outline of the night sky visible through the gap. But it wasn't the sight of the night that made my heart race. It was the feeling. The sensation that someone, something, was standing just outside the window, watching me. I quickly closed the curtains and turned away, my mind screaming at me to do something. Anything. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the house itself couldn't protect me from whatever was out there. I tried to distract myself by grabbing my phone. I needed to call someone, tell them about the strange happenings, ask for reassurance that this was just my imagination running wild. But as I picked up the phone, I noticed something odd. The time. It was nearly midnight, but somehow the clock on my phone seemed off. The seconds were skipping ahead, fast, too fast. It was almost as if time itself was warping. I let out a shaky breath and tossed the phone onto the couch. The urge to leave, to drive away, was overwhelming. But where would I go? Back to the beach? I couldn't go back there. But then, I remembered the journal. The words written on the pages. I'm not alone anymore. Who had written them? And why did they sound so certain? It was like they knew what I was feeling, like they were watching me even now. I knew I had to go back. I had to find out what was really happening. The next morning, I returned to the beach. The fog was thicker than before, and the air smelled heavier, as if something was hanging just below the surface, waiting to be uncovered. It wasn't as peaceful now. The place felt wrong, tainted by whatever had happened yesterday. I walked down the same stretch of shoreline where I had found the bag. The sand was cold under my feet, the waves crashing louder than before, almost as if they were warning me to turn back. But I had come too far. I reached the spot where I had left the bag. And there, just like before, was a new set of footprints. The same kind of footprints I had seen yesterday, half buried, as if they hadn't fully touched the sand. They weren't mine. I hadn't been walking barefoot, and the tracks didn't match my own. They were light, like someone had walked softly, carefully, barely disturbing the sand. I followed the prints, my heart pounding in my chest. They led me further along the beach, past the rocks and toward a small cove. It was a part of the beach I hadn't explored before, hidden behind a cluster of jagged boulders. The fog was thicker here, the air colder. And then, I saw something that made my stomach twist. A figure. Standing in the distance, partially obscured by the fog, but I could make out the outline of a person. They weren't moving. Just standing there, facing away from me, staring out at the ocean. I stopped. My body frozen. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like I had seen this figure before, but I couldn't remember when or where. The same shape, the same silhouette. The footsteps had led me to this person. But who were they? Why were they here? I called out, my voice shaky. Hello? Are you okay? There was no response. I took a few tentative steps closer, my eyes never leaving the figure. I had to know if they were real. If they were the one who had left the journal in my car. But just as I reached out to speak again, the figure turned. Slowly. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a person. Not in the way I thought. The face, or what should have been a face, was nothing but a smooth, featureless surface. No eyes. No mouth. Just an empty, blank mask. And then it spoke. Not with a voice, but with a feeling. A presence that filled my mind. You shouldn't have come back. I froze, the words echoing in my head like a warning. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. Something was holding me in place, like an invisible force gripping my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I turned to flee, but before I could take a step, the world around me went black. The last thing I heard was the sound of footsteps, faint but growing louder. When I woke, I was no longer on the beach. The soft, grainy sand had given way to something hard and cold beneath me. My eyes fluttered open, but everything was blurry, out of focus. I blinked several times, trying to clear the fog in my mind. My head was pounding, and a sharp pain shot through my neck as I tried to sit up. I was lying on the floor of what looked like an old, abandoned house. The walls around me were decaying, their peeling paint revealing the bare wood beneath. The air was damp and stale, the smell of mildew thick in my nose. The faint light filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows only added to the unsettling atmosphere. I could barely make out the shapes in the room, but one thing was clear, this wasn't anywhere near the beach. I slowly pushed myself up, my body trembling with fear and confusion. My mind raced. How had I ended up here? One moment, I had been on the beach, staring at that faceless figure, and now I was in this place. Had I been dragged here? Had I passed out and wandered in some kind of delirium? I pushed myself to my feet, trying to steady myself as I scanned the room. Everything felt wrong, this place, this atmosphere, it was suffocating. There was an odd feeling of déjà vu, as if I had been here before, even though I was sure I had never seen this house in my life. The silence was oppressive. Even the wind seemed to have stopped outside, as if it, too, was holding its breath. I took a cautious step forward, my ears straining for any sound. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. There was nothing there. Just the empty, decaying walls. I slowly turned back toward the center of the room, where I noticed something I hadn't before. A table overturned, its contents scattered across the floor. Papers, old books, and broken pieces of furniture lay in disarray, but there was one thing that stood out. A small, weathered box nestled beneath a pile of debris. I couldn't explain why, but something about that box drew me to it. I knew I had to see what was inside. I carefully moved the debris away, my fingers trembling as I picked up the box. It was wooden, old, and intricately carved, with strange symbols etched into the surface. Symbols I didn't recognize, but that felt oddly familiar, like they were imprinted on my very soul. I felt a sharp pang of fear, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Something was compelling me to open it. With a deep breath, I pried the lid open. Inside was a small, folded piece of paper. I picked it up, my hand shaking as I unfolded it. The writing was hurried, scrawled in a way that was almost frantic. I read the words aloud, my voice shaking. They're watching. Always watching. They don't leave. No one leaves. My heart raced as the words echoed in my mind. I felt a coldness sweep through me. A sense of inevitability. I was not alone. I wasn't alone in this house. The floorboards creaked. I froze. I slowly turned, but again, there was nothing there. No movement. No sounds. Just the eerie silence that now felt suffocating. I couldn't tell if my mind was playing tricks on me or if there was something truly wrong with this place. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Whatever had been at the beach, whatever had followed me, it was here now. Suddenly, the air seemed to change. The temperature dropped, and the light from the windows flickered, as if something was blocking it from outside. The shadows in the room stretched longer, twisting in unnatural ways. My skin prickled with the sensation of being surrounded, of being trapped in a space that wasn't truly empty. I heard it again. Footsteps. They were coming from above. I stared at the ceiling, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps were slow but deliberate, heavy, like someone or something was moving around up there, just above me. I wanted to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat, held by a fear too paralyzing to release. I took a step back, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting, listening. The footsteps paused, and for a moment, the silence seemed to stretch on forever. Then, a soft voice, barely a whisper, came from above, like a faint murmur, but it sounded like it was speaking directly into my ear. Come find me. My body froze in place, my blood turning to ice. The voice, it wasn't human. It was as though the house itself had spoken. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I turned, rushing for the door, but as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I yanked at the door, but it stayed firmly locked. I turned, frantically looking around the room, and that's when I saw it. A figure. Not just any figure. The same faceless shape I had seen on the beach. It was standing in the doorway, its blank, smooth face staring at me. Its body was still, like a statue, but I could feel its presence in the room. I could feel it closing in on me, suffocating me with its silence. I backed away, my legs shaking beneath me, but the figure didn't move. It didn't have to. I could feel it now, not just standing there, but watching me. I was the one being hunted. I was the one who had been marked. I wasn't meant to leave. The figure tilted its head slightly, and that's when I heard the faint sound of more footsteps. They were coming from behind me now, from the far corner of the room. It was no longer just one presence. It was as if the entire room was filled with them, whispering, moving, closing in. I turned again, this time with no hope of escape. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the faceless figure slowly walking toward me, its hollow eyes locked on mine. And I knew then that I was never meant to leave this place. I was never meant to escape. Not alive. Not sane. And the darkness, like the beach, would follow me forever. I opened my eyes again. But this time, there was nothing. No house. No beach. Only the endless, suffocating dark. The air was heavy with the scent of salt water, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the faintest whisper. "It's too late." And I knew I had become a part of it. I woke up with a start, gasping for air, my chest tight. I tried to sit up, but I felt a heaviness, as if something invisible was weighing me down, pressing me into the darkness. The sensation was all-consuming, like being trapped in a deep, suffocating pit with no way out. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I struggled to breathe, but there was something strange about the air here, thick, oppressive, almost as if it were alive. I couldn't see anything. The darkness was absolute, more suffocating than any night I had ever experienced. I reached out, feeling the cold, damp air around me, trying to make sense of my surroundings. My fingers brushed against something soft, almost fabric-like, but I quickly recoiled. The sensation sent a chill of dread through me. "Where am I?" I thought, my voice barely a whisper. There was no answer. Just silence. Complete, utter silence. But then, I heard something. A soft, faint rustling sound, like fabric moving in the dark. The sound seemed to come from every direction, as though the darkness itself were shifting. And then, from somewhere far away, a voice. It wasn't the whisper of the faceless figure, but it was just as chilling. "You can't escape." My heart froze. The voice was low, almost mournful, and it came from all around me. I tried to call out, but my voice didn't reach my lips. I opened my mouth, but no sound came. I couldn't even scream. The realization hit me then, like a slap to the face. I wasn't alone. No, far worse. I was trapped. I tried to move, to stand, but it was as though my body had been paralyzed by the very darkness that surrounded me. I couldn't even see my hands when I held them in front of my face. There was no light, no shape, just this never-ending void. Then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard it again. The faintest sound, growing louder with every passing second. The sound of footsteps echoing through the blackness. I wasn't alone. And whatever it was getting closer. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, my mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening. The footsteps were deliberate now, slow but relentless. The sound was all-consuming, vibrating through the air around me. I could feel it getting closer, and I knew, deep in my gut, that it wasn't human. The air grew colder with each step, the temperature dropping as if some unseen force was pulling the heat from the space around me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. My eyes were wide, straining to make sense of the darkness, but there was nothing but the oppressive weight of the air and the endless footsteps. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice again, faint, but it sent a shiver through my spine. It sounded so close now, as if it were right beside me, whispering in my ear. I tried to twist my body, to look over my shoulder, but there was nothing. Just the silence. And then, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps themselves. It was a silence that pressed in on me, like the darkness was watching, waiting for something. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if it were alive and it knew what I was feeling. What is it waiting for? The question echoed in my mind as I stood there, paralyzed. The darkness seemed to close in around me. It wasn't just dark, it was suffocating. There was something wrong with it, something unnatural. And it was coming for me. Then, as though a switch had been flipped, I felt a sharp pull. It started in my chest, like something was yanking me from the inside. I gasped for air, but my lungs refused to fill. I felt a coldness, deep and unbearable, spreading through my body like ice. It wasn't just physical, it was in my bones, in my soul. It's too late. The words pierced through the stillness, clear and sharp. But they weren't spoken aloud. They were inside my mind, a thought I didn't think, a truth I didn't want to accept. It was too late for me. I had crossed a line, gone too far, and now there was no turning back. And then I saw it. In the distance, in the thick blackness, a shape began to form. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow in the depths, but it grew. Slowly, at first. Then faster. And before I could react, it was right in front of me. A face. But not a face like any I had ever seen before. It was smooth, featureless, just like the one from the beach. But this time, it wasn't just an empty mask. There was a presence behind it. Something ancient, something alive. The void around me seemed to pulse with its presence, like the darkness itself was bending to its will. It tilted its head slightly, and that's when I saw the mouth. A thin line, opening slowly, revealing nothing but a void, a dark, endless void that seemed to pull everything into it. And then, it spoke. "You're ours now." I tried to back away, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs were frozen, my arms heavy at my sides. I was trapped, suffocating under the weight of its gaze, its presence. The last thing I saw before the darkness closed in completely was the figure, its hollow eyes staring into mine, and I understood. I wasn't going to survive this. I had been chosen, and there was no escape. It was a regular Tuesday evening. The kind of evening that felt empty, quiet. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the ticking of the clock on the wall were the only sounds breaking the silence in my apartment. I was curled up on the couch, scrolling through my phone, trying to pass the time. The apartment was small but cozy, with the familiar scent of coffee and old books lingering in the air. Everything was as it always had been. That's when the phone rang. It wasn't an unusual sound. My phone buzzed softly against the wooden table, vibrating just enough to pull my attention away from the screen. I glanced at the caller ID, expecting it to be a friend or maybe a work-related call. But instead, there was nothing. No name, no number, just an unknown, unlisted number flashing on the screen. I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the accept button. Usually, I wouldn't answer calls like this. But something about it nagged at me. I don't know why, but I felt an odd compulsion to pick up. Maybe it was the solitude of the evening, or maybe it was just the way the phone rang, insistent, almost impatient. I swiped the screen and held the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice sounding small in the silence of the room. There was nothing on the other end. No greeting, no response. Just silence. At first, I thought maybe the connection was bad, or maybe I accidentally picked up too soon. I waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like minutes. But still, nothing. Just silence. A strange, oppressive silence that made my skin prickle. I was about to hang up, thinking it was some sort of glitch, when I heard it. A faint, distant sound, almost like breathing. Soft, shallow breaths. It made my heart skip a beat. I leaned in closer to the phone, my mind racing. Could it be a prank? Was someone just playing with me? But the breath sounded so real, so close, like someone was right there, on the other end of the line. I opened my mouth to speak again, to ask if anyone was there, but before I could, the sound stopped. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in confusion, my heart still pounding. The screen displayed that the call had ended, but my mind refused to settle. I sat there for a moment, holding the phone, unsure of what to make of it. A prank? A mistake? Or something else entirely? I shook my head, trying to brush off the unease creeping through me. It was probably nothing. Just a weird coincidence. I tried to tell myself that. I placed the phone back down on the table and tried to return to what I had been doing. But the silence that followed felt different. It was thicker, more suffocating. The clock on the wall, which had been ticking so steadily, suddenly seemed louder, more intrusive. I glanced at the phone again, almost expecting it to ring once more. But it didn't. I tried to focus on the screen of my phone, but the unease wouldn't leave. I had the feeling something was watching me. Something just beyond my awareness. I could feel it in the way the air around me seemed to thicken. The apartment, usually my sanctuary, now felt unfamiliar. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, more pronounced. Was it just my imagination? I wasn't sure. And then, just as I thought I could relax, the phone buzzed again. The same unknown number. I hesitated this time. My finger hovered over the screen, my pulse quickening. The last call had unsettled me, and the silence, the breathing, it still echoed in my ears. But again, the urge to answer tugged at me. What if it was something important? What if it was someone in trouble? I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and answered the call. "Hello?" I said again, this time my voice trembling slightly. But again, there was nothing. No response. Just that same eerie silence. I waited, expecting the faint sound of breathing to return, but nothing happened. The line was still. I was about to end the call when I heard it again. A noise, distant at first, but growing louder. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound. It wasn't coming from the phone, but from somewhere else in the room. I froze. The tapping was slow, methodical. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like fingernails lightly drumming against wood. My eyes darted around the apartment, scanning the familiar space. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper now, like they were closing in on me. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was undeniable. It was coming from behind me, from somewhere near the hallway. My heart raced in my chest as I slowly turned to look, expecting to see something, anything, but the hallway remained dark, empty. The tapping stopped abruptly. Then came a whisper, so faint I almost didn't hear it at all. But it was there. "Come closer." The voice was soft, almost seductive, and it made my skin crawl. I turned back to the phone, my hand trembling as I held it to my ear. There was no longer any breathing, no more tapping. Just a heavy silence. And then, the call ended again. I sat there, unable to move, my heart thumping in my chest. What the hell was going on? My fingers gripped the phone tighter, as though somehow holding onto it would make the fear go away. But I knew deep down it wouldn't. I didn't know who had called or what they wanted, but something told me that I had just crossed a line, and that the worst was yet to come. I spent the next few minutes staring at the phone in my hand, trying to catch my breath, but the weight of the silence around me only seemed to grow. My heart was still racing, and my fingers shook as I placed the phone back down on the table, my mind reeling with confusion and fear. Who could that have been? And why didn't they speak? I glanced at the clock on the wall. Only a few minutes had passed since the last call. It felt like hours. The apartment, once a comforting space, now felt oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on me. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, that someone was messing with me, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. The tapping, the whisper, it all felt too real, too intentional. Just as I was about to stand up and shake off the feeling, the phone buzzed again. I froze. My gaze snapped to the screen. The same unknown number. I should have ignored it. I should have let it go to voicemail, but I didn't. Something inside me, a mix of curiosity and dread, urged me to answer. I had to know. I needed to hear something, anything, to make sense of this. Maybe, just maybe, this time it would be different. I took a deep breath and answered the call, my voice shaky as I said, "Hello?" There was no response. No voice. Just that same, suffocating silence. I held the phone to my ear, waiting for something to happen. I could hear my breath, slow and unsteady, as the minutes seemed to stretch on. The silence was so thick it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums, suffocating me, making it impossible to focus on anything else. Then, just as before, the faintest sound emerged. A soft scratching, like nails dragging against fabric. It was coming from somewhere close, so close, I could almost feel it against my skin. My breath hitched, my heart skipping a beat as I looked around the room. The apartment was empty. The walls were still. But that sound, it was getting louder. Closer. The scratching stopped abruptly. And then, the whisper came again, soft and chilling. "Are you alone?" My blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable, dark, familiar, but wrong in some way I couldn't quite understand. It felt like a shadow creeping across my mind, suffocating me from the inside out. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was dry, tight, as if something invisible was constricting around it. The question lingered in the air, hanging between us like a deadly promise. Suddenly, the phone crackled. A burst of static exploded in my ear, sharp and jarring. It was so loud that I winced and pulled the phone away from my head, but the static didn't stop. It grew louder, more intense, until it felt like my ears would explode from the pressure. I slammed the phone down on the table, gasping for breath. My pulse was racing, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The air in the room felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in just a few seconds. I looked around again, feeling the panic building in my chest. The apartment was still, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. I stepped back, my eyes darting nervously from corner to corner. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, and the space that had always felt safe now seemed wrong. Then the phone buzzed again. I flinched, every muscle on my body tensing as I looked at the screen. The unknown number. Again. My stomach churned, and I almost couldn't bring myself to answer. What if this time it wasn't just a prank? But I couldn't ignore it. Not now. Something had shifted. Something was wrong. I answered the call. This time, I didn't speak. I just waited, my breath shallow, my eyes darting toward the door, the windows. The quiet in the apartment felt too heavy, like it was holding its breath. This time, there was no silence. Instead, I heard something else. A voice. A whisper. It was soft, but clear. "You're not alone." I froze. The words sent a wave of terror through me. My entire body went rigid, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The voice, it was coming from the phone. But also, not from the phone. It was in the room. I could hear it behind me, in front of me. It was all around me. The whispering continued, but it was no longer just a single voice. It was a chorus, low, guttural, overlapping, as though hundreds of voices were speaking at once. "You're not alone." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I could feel the fear crawling up my throat, but it was stuck. My body refused to obey. The whispers continued, growing louder, more frantic, the voices twisted and overlapping until they became a maddening cacophony. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went quiet. The voices stopped. The phone line went dead. I dropped the phone onto the table, gasping for air, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The apartment was silent once again. But it was different. It was heavier. More suffocating. I felt the weight of the silence, the stillness pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I wasn't alone. The thought repeated in my mind, louder than the whispers had been. I looked around, my heart hammering in my chest, my eyes wide with terror. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the room with me, watching, waiting. I couldn't escape it. The fear, the presence, it was suffocating. And the worst part was, I knew this was just the beginning. It was an hour before I could bring myself to move. An hour spent sitting in the same spot, eyes glued to the phone on the table, as if it might suddenly spring to life and give me answers I so desperately needed. The silence around me felt suffocating, an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. Every creak of the apartment, every shift in the air, made me jump. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, echoing in my ears as if I were drowning. I tried to convince myself that it had all been some kind of mistake. A prank. Some twisted joke by a friend, or maybe some malfunction in the phone system. But deep down, I knew better. I couldn't explain what had happened. I couldn't explain the voices, the whispers, the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room even when I clearly was. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked toward the kitchen, hoping a glass of water might calm my nerves. The sound of my footsteps echoed too loudly in the apartment, reminding me of how empty it felt. My reflection in the window caught my eye, and for a brief moment, I saw something in it that wasn't there before. A shadow. A figure standing just behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. Still. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things or if the fear had truly begun to make me lose my mind. I grabbed the glass from the counter, trying to steady my trembling hands. The water was cold, but it didn't help. The chill in the air, the heaviness that had settled in the room, only seemed to grow. I was about to sit back down when the phone rang again. I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. My stomach twisted in knots. I had been hoping, praying that it wouldn't happen again. But there it was, the same unknown number flashing on the screen. I could feel the dread building up inside me, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to answer. I didn't want to, but I had no choice. I swallowed hard and picked up the phone, my fingers numb as I pressed it to my ear. "Hello?" My voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. This time, there was no silence. No static. No breathing. Just a low, constant hum, like the sound of a distant engine or something buried deep underground. I could feel it vibrating through the phone, creeping under my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I listened closely, trying to make sense of the sound. It was rhythmic, almost mechanical, and for a moment, I thought it was just the wind or the hum of an old electrical appliance. But then the sound shifted. It morphed into something else, something darker. A tapping. Soft at first, then louder, like fingers drumming against a wooden surface. Tap. 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 It was coming from the phone. No, it was coming from somewhere else. Somewhere close. I looked around the room again, my heart in my throat. The tapping continued, growing more frantic, more insistent. Tap. 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 It echoed in the apartment, filling the space with a hollow, desperate sound. I set the phone down, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The tapping didn't stop. It was all around me now. Everywhere. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls, from beneath the floorboards. I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through the air. My eyes darted to the door, to the windows. But everything was still. Too still. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I felt my blood run cold. My hands were clammy as I picked up the phone again, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Hello?" I whispered again, the words escaping me almost without thought. There was a long pause, and then a voice, soft, almost tender, spoke from the other end. "Come to the window." The words sent a jolt of fear through my entire body. The voice was familiar, but not in any way I could understand. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was wrong. I glanced toward the window. The blinds were drawn, and the room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the cracks in the curtains. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to hang up and pretend it was just a bad dream. But I couldn't. The voice, the whispering command, echoed in my mind, pulling me toward the window. I didn't move immediately. My heart raced and my stomach churned. Something wasn't right. But the words, "Come to the window," kept playing in my head like a broken record. I couldn't fight it. With trembling hands, I stood and walked toward the window. The phone was still pressed to my ear, and the voice was gone. The line was silent again, but the sense of dread in the air was palpable, heavy. As I reached the window, I hesitated. The chill in the air seemed colder, and I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against me. The street outside was quiet, the only movement coming from the trees swaying gently in the wind. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain the terror building inside me. But the voice had told me to look outside. I pulled the blinds up slowly, my breath held tight in my chest. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the empty road stretched out before me. But then, at the very edge of my vision, I saw something. A figure. A silhouette, standing at the far end of the street. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its form indistinct but somehow wrong. The figure stood still, as if watching, waiting. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me, burning through the darkness. I froze. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if waiting for something. For me. I couldn't breathe. My throat closed up, and my heart pounded so loudly in my chest I thought it would burst. And then the voice came again, faint but clear, like a whisper in my ear. "It's closer now." I slammed the blind shut, stumbling backward, my body trembling uncontrollably. I looked around the room in panic, every corner feeling like it was hiding something. I wasn't alone. It had followed me. It had always been there. And it was getting closer. The phone had fallen from my hand, landing with a soft thud on the carpet. I didn't even notice. My entire focus was on the figure outside. It was still there. Even though the blinds were drawn, even though the window was closed, I felt it. The presence, like a shadow creeping through the walls, always just at the edge of my vision. I backed away from the window, my body moving instinctively, almost against my will. My mind screamed at me to move, to escape, but my legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place. My eyes kept darting to the door, the windows, any escape. But there was nowhere to run. The apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt like a trap. The phone on the floor buzzed. I froze. I didn't want to pick it up. I didn't want to hear that voice again, that whisper, that presence. But somehow, my hand reached for the phone, trembling, my fingers cold and slick. The screen glowed faintly, the unknown number staring back at me like a warning. I answered it. No words came immediately. Only that same, low hum, like a distant engine rumbling beneath the surface of the earth. But then, a sound pierced through the static. A crackling noise, sharp and urgent. It wasn't the hum of the phone anymore. It was closer, louder, more aggressive. I could hear something. Breathing. Soft. Ragged. Labored. I couldn't place it. Was it from the phone? From the figure outside? Or was it something in the room with me? It's in the room with me. The thought hit me with such clarity, it was as if it had been planted there, like a seed buried deep in my mind, sprouting into something terrible. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick with tension. I could almost feel the breath, hot, foul, on the back of my neck. The hairs on my arms stood up, and my pulse quickened. I slowly turned, my eyes scanning the room. The dark corners, the faint outline of the furniture, the shadows stretching across the walls. It felt as though the room itself had grown larger, more oppressive. The familiar space I had once felt so comfortable and had become a maze, each corner hiding something waiting to be discovered. It's close. The phone line crackled again, the breathing louder, sharper. I could almost hear a whisper within it. No, it wasn't a whisper. It was a voice. Familiar, but twisted. I'm here. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was the same voice. The voice I had heard before, but now it was clearer, more distinct. And it wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was coming from within the room. I whipped around, scanning the corners of the apartment. Nothing. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though they were reaching for me. The temperature had dropped drastically, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I took a step back, my feet suddenly unsure beneath me. And then I heard it. A tap. It was faint, like a nail tapping against wood, but it was there. Soft at first. Tap. 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 I spun toward the sound. My eyes darted to the far corner of the living room. The shadows there seemed deeper, darker. And then it came again, louder this time. Tap. 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 I took a shaky breath, barely able to keep my feet steady. The tapping was so precise, so deliberate, like someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body refused to move. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my legs were rooted to the spot. The tapping grew louder, closer. It was as if the sound was coming from inside the walls, from under the floor. It reverberated in my bones, vibrating through my body, shaking me to my core. And then, in the midst of it, the whisper came again. Not from the phone, but from somewhere behind me. Come closer. I felt a cold breath against my ear, and before I could react, the room went dark. The lights flickered and died, plunging the apartment into complete blackness. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stumbled backward, my hands reaching out blindly for something, anything to ground me. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive darkness pressing in on me. The tapping was gone. The whispers were gone. And in that silence, I felt the air shift. Something was moving in the darkness. Something close. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around me. The room felt larger now, stretching outward, as if I were standing on the edge of an endless void. I could hear my breathing, shallow and panicked, breaking the stillness. And then, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were elongated and unnatural, its body shrouded in darkness. I could barely make out the contours of its form, but I could feel its presence. It was suffocating. It was here. I tried to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat. My legs finally gave out, and I crumpled to the floor, my back hitting the cold tiles. I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, its eyes piercing through the darkness, seeing me in a way that felt wrong. You're not alone. The voice. It was the same voice that had haunted me from the phone. The voice that had whispered through the walls. It was here, in front of me, and it was not human. I could feel its presence closing in. It was everywhere. Inside my head. Inside my soul. There was no escape. I'm here to stay. The last words, soft but filled with a chilling finality, echoed in my mind. I reached out for the phone, for any sense of normalcy, but it was too late. The figure reached down, and in that moment, I knew my fear had become my reality. I could feel it standing over me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. I couldn't see its face, but I didn't need to. The air around me had grown so thick, so heavy, that I could almost taste it, cold, bitter, and sharp, like the aftertaste of a nightmare. My body refused to move, paralyzed by fear, by the sheer weight of whatever this thing was. The room was silent except for the sound of my frantic breathing, and in that silence, I heard a faint buzzing. The phone. It had fallen somewhere on the floor, lying on its side, still alive with the persistent, insistent buzz of an incoming call. The glow of the screen shone faintly through the darkness, casting an eerie light that only intensified the shadows around me. I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to pick it up again. But my hand reached out anyway, trembling as if controlled by some unseen force. I touched the phone and brought it to my ear, my fingers numb, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. There was only the hum. That endless, oppressive hum that seemed to reverberate through my bones. It was the sound of nothing, the sound of something inhuman, something that didn't belong in this world. I could feel it in my chest, vibrating deep within my ribs. It was alive, but not in any way I could comprehend. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, raw, choked by fear. I was suffocating, not from lack of air, but from the sense that whatever this thing was, it was closing in, inch by inch, squeezing the life out of me. And then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, the voice returned. I'm still here. It was quieter now. Closer. Softer. But it wasn't the same voice I had heard before. This time, it was colder, more hollow, as if it was coming from a deep, dark well. It felt as though the very words were slipping through the cracks in my mind, crawling inside my thoughts. You can't escape. My pulse raced. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. My limbs felt numb, my vision blurry. It felt like I was sinking, drowning in a sea of darkness and terror. The phone had become a lifeline, an anchor, but it was also pulling me deeper into this madness. I could feel the pressure of it, the suffocating weight, pressing down on me with each passing second. I wanted to scream, to fight back, to do something, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in my own mind. The hum turned into a low, grating sound, a scraping, like metal against metal. I jerked back in terror, but the noise only grew louder, more persistent. It was as if the very walls of the room were closing in, shifting and grinding like the teeth of some monstrous creature. I could feel its eyes on me. It was watching me. You're mine now. The voice was so close, I could almost feel its breath on my skin. And then, the phone went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I could do anything at all. My mind was spinning, my thoughts tangled in a mess of fear and confusion. I tried to move, but my body felt like it was made of stone, heavy and unyielding. And then, slowly, the figure stepped forward. It was so tall. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, and it moved with a fluidity that seemed wrong. It was made of darkness, its body a shifting, fluid mass that distorted the space around it. I couldn't make out any details, no eyes, no face, just an empty, hollow shape that seemed to absorb all the light, leaving only a cold void behind. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice was gone. My legs wouldn't obey me. All I could do was watch as it drew closer, its presence growing until it consumed the entire room. I was trapped in the silence. The last thing I remember was its touch, cold, so cold that it burned, like ice scraping against my skin. It was everywhere, engulfing me, pulling me into the void with it. And then, there was nothing. Just silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. When I woke, the apartment was empty. The light was soft, gentle, as if nothing had ever happened. But the silence was deeper now, heavier, as if the world itself had become quieter, colder. I reached for my phone, but it was gone. The calls had stopped. The whispers had stopped. But I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. I looked around the room one last time, and then I left. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. Not anymore. The figure had been right. I would never be alone again. I woke up in my bed, the light streaming through the window, as it always did. The room felt warm, familiar, and for a moment, I thought nothing had changed. I stretched, blinking in the sunlight, trying to shake off the remnants of a restless sleep. But something was different. There was a strange stillness in the air, a heaviness that clung to the atmosphere like a fog. My senses were alert, sharp. I stood up, walking over to the window, and pulled back the curtains. The street was empty. It was early in the morning, I knew that much, but where were the usual sounds of traffic, people walking to work, the distant hum of city life? The street was completely still. No cars, no people, no noise. It was like the city had been abandoned in the middle of the night, and I was the only one left. At first, I assumed it was just an odd moment. Maybe it was a holiday, maybe something strange had caused a temporary pause. But as I looked out further, there was no sign of movement anywhere. The benches in the park were empty, the shops were dark, and the usual hustle of the city felt like a distant memory. I shook my head, trying to shake off the discomfort creeping up my spine. It's nothing, I thought. Maybe everyone was still asleep. I decided to go outside to find answers, but when I opened the door and stepped out into the cold air, my pulse quickened. It was more than just an empty street. The silence was suffocating. No wind, no birds, no distant chatter. The air seemed to press against me, pushing down with an invisible weight. My footsteps echoed loudly on the pavement, too loud for a place so empty. I walked down the street, my heart racing, the unsettling silence growing heavier with every step. I turned the corner and saw the empty bus stop, the benches neatly lined up with no one sitting. The newspaper stand was full, untouched, as if time had frozen. I glanced around, expecting someone, anyone, to appear from one of the buildings. But there was nothing. I called out, my voice barely breaking the air. Hello? I waited, but only my own voice echoed back. I tried again, louder this time. Is anyone there? Nothing. My stomach twisted into a knot. I walked faster, my mind spinning, trying to rationalize this situation. Maybe it was some kind of strange glitch. Maybe a natural disaster had struck, and everyone had taken shelter somewhere. But why was I the only one out here? I walked past familiar storefronts, now strangely still and silent. The shops that usually blared music or welcomed customers were closed, lifeless. A chill ran down my spine. I needed answers. I needed to find someone, to hear another voice, to know I wasn't completely alone in this city. But as I walked, a new feeling began to creep in. A feeling that I wasn't just isolated, I was being watched. I looked over my shoulder, but saw no one. The street stretched out endlessly, empty, untouched. But still, that unsettling sensation gnawed at the back of my mind. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should, every alley darker and deeper than before. The silence, which at first seemed comforting, now felt menacing. I began to hear things. At first, I thought they were just the normal sounds of the city returning, a distant footstep, the creak of a door, a faint rustle in the wind. But there was no wind, and no one was walking. I stopped, listening, and the world around me seemed to shift. The sound I thought I heard was now clearer. It was the sound of something faintly scraping on the pavement, just beyond my vision. I turned sharply, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. My breath caught in my throat. I had to be imagining things. But then I heard it again. This time, it was closer. The scraping noise, like something dragging along the ground, coming from an alleyway nearby. My body tensed. I stood still, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as a chill washed over me. There was something, or someone, out there. I didn't know whether to run or stay, whether the thing that was watching me was something natural or something far worse. But deep down, I knew that whatever it wasn't human. I had to find answers. I had to keep moving. There was no turning back now. But as I walked toward the sound, my footsteps seemed to fall more slowly, more heavily, as if the world itself was trying to stop me from going further. I pressed on, my feet dragging now, unwilling to let the fear control me, but it was hard. Each step felt like it carried a weight heavier than the last. The sound was growing clearer, more distinct. It was a dragging noise, like something scraping the ground, and it was getting closer, though I couldn't see a thing. I turned into the alley, my heart pounding louder than ever. The shadows here were darker than they should have been, the walls seeming to close in as I moved deeper into the narrow passage. The sound was right there, right around the corner, but I still couldn't see anything. I stopped and held my breath, straining to hear anything that might give me a clue. The scrape, scrape continued, almost rhythmic now, as if whatever was making it had all the time in the world. But why? Why was it alone? Why wasn't anyone else here? Why was the city empty? I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take another step. The alley opened into a small courtyard, and in the center of it stood an old fountain, dry, cracked, with weeds growing around its base. The scrape was louder here, now coming from somewhere behind the fountain. I could feel my heart in my throat. The sound was almost deliberate, like someone was taking their time. Suddenly, a noise cut through the air, a low, guttural growl. I froze. It came from behind the fountain, and I couldn't tell if it was an animal or something else entirely. My breath caught. What was that? What could possibly growl like that in an empty city? I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound, my eyes scanning the dark corners, the shadows that seemed to move and shift unnaturally. The scraping noise had stopped. All I could hear now was the growl, echoing in the air like a warning. And then, I saw it. A figure emerged from behind the fountain, slow and deliberate, stepping into the patch of dim light from the street lamp above. My blood ran cold. It wasn't human. Not entirely, at least. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed far too long for any human body. Its face. I couldn't see a face. The figure's head was a black, smooth surface, like the featureless void of a mask. But its body, though human-shaped, was wrong in every way. The skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its fingers were too long, dragging along the pavement in an almost graceful, eerie manner. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the figure, watching as it took slow, deliberate steps toward me. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like a heat haze, and I felt the temperature drop. The ground beneath my feet was no longer solid. It felt like I was standing on something soft, something that could give way at any moment. I had no idea what this thing was, but it wasn't from this world. I was certain of that. The growl rumbled again, louder this time, reverberating through the courtyard. The creature's head tilted slightly to one side, as though it was studying me. I could feel its eyes, though I couldn't see them, boring into me, sending a wave of nausea through my stomach. I wanted to scream, to run, but I could barely move. The thing was drawing closer now, its footsteps echoing in my mind as much as in the alley. I tried to speak, to demand an explanation, to ask it what it wanted, but my voice was lost, choked by the overwhelming fear. My chest tightened, my vision blurred, and I could feel myself sinking into the overwhelming darkness that seemed to spread out from the figure. In the distance, I thought I heard something, a faint sound, like footsteps, but it was far away. Far too far to be anyone who could help. The creature was right in front of me now. I could feel the air thickening around it, colder, sharper, like ice wrapping itself around my lungs. It raised one of its hands, and I could see its fingers twitching as though preparing to strike. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It stared at me for a long moment as though considering something. Then, without a sound, it turned and began to walk away, its slow, scraping footsteps fading into the distance. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was still frozen in place, too afraid to take a step, even as the figure disappeared into the shadows. What was that? What had I just seen? My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible, trying to find some explanation that could make me feel safe again. But there was none. I was alone in a city with no one left, and whatever that thing was, it wasn't finished yet. I could feel it watching me, waiting. I turned and ran, stumbling over my own feet, desperate to get out of the alley, out of the empty city, out of the terror that was closing in on me. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. The cold air stung my skin, the silence pressing against me like an invisible weight. The only sound was the pounding of my heart, racing in time with the echo of my footsteps as they bounced off the empty walls around me. But the farther I ran, the more I felt that creeping presence again. Something was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure, but there was nothing. The street behind me was as empty as it had been when I first stepped outside. No one, not a single soul. Yet the oppressive feeling that I was being followed persisted, and I couldn't shake it. I turned down another street, desperate to find someone, anyone. Maybe it was all just a nightmare. Maybe if I kept running, I would wake up. But the longer I moved through the city, the more the world around me felt wrong. The buildings seemed to loom higher than they should, their windows reflecting back an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. The streets, though perfectly intact, looked abandoned for years, not just hours. I stopped in front of a large, darkened store, its glass windows reflecting the empty street. Something caught my eye in the window. It was a figure, a shadow, standing behind the glass, motionless. I froze, staring at the figure. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. The shape was wrong. It was too tall, like the figure I had seen earlier, but there was something off about it, something that made my stomach churn with dread. I stepped closer, my eyes fixed on the reflection in the glass. I could see the shadow shifting ever so slightly. And then, just as I was about to turn away, it moved. The shadow was not a trick of the light. It was something else entirely. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, my mind racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure in the window. It was watching me, that much was clear. I could feel it, a cold, heavy sensation pressing down on me, like the figure was staring directly into my soul. My body trembled, but I couldn't stop myself from walking closer. Suddenly, the figure stepped forward, pressing itself against the glass, its hands flattened against the window, its face, that faceless mask, inches away from mine. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, and yet I couldn't pull away, couldn't move, as if the shadow was somehow keeping me rooted to the spot. The world felt like it was closing in on me. The silence, the emptiness, the sense of being watched, it was suffocating. Then, without warning, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, staring at me, and the next, it was gone, as though it had never been. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the window, waiting for it to reappear, but it didn't. It was just another empty, lifeless reflection. I turned away quickly, my mind spinning. I couldn't stay here. I needed to find answers, to find someone, to know that I wasn't losing my mind. But where could I go? The city felt endless, each street the same, each corner the same, empty, desolate, abandoned. I walked faster, my feet pounding against the pavement as I tried to ignore the growing feeling that something was closing in on me, that I was being followed once again. I couldn't shake the sensation, no matter how much I tried to rationalize it. Every alley seemed darker, every shadow seemed deeper, and the air felt heavier with each passing second. As I rounded the next corner, I spotted something ahead, a figure. A real person, standing in the middle of the street, just as still and unmoving as the shadows I had seen before. I stopped dead in my tracks. Was it another one of those things? My heart raced. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move toward it, desperate to know if I was finally seeing another human being. As I got closer, I could make out more details. The person was wearing a jacket, their hair blowing slightly in the breeze, if there even was one. They looked ordinary, just like someone who had been waiting for a bus or walking their dog, not like the twisted figures I had encountered earlier. I stopped just a few feet away from them, my voice trembling. "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't move. No response. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening. I reached out a hand, gently touching their shoulder. The figure collapsed to the ground. My breath hitched as I knelt down beside them. But as soon as I touched their skin, I recoiled. It was cold, far too cold for someone who should have been alive. The skin was unnaturally stiff, like it had been frozen for hours. My fingers brushed against the person's face, and there were no features, no eyes, no mouth. Just a smooth, featureless surface. I pulled back in shock, my heart racing. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. My thoughts spun in every direction, desperately trying to process what I was seeing. But the truth was undeniable. The person wasn't alive. It was another one of them. A faceless, lifeless figure that had once been human but was now something else. Something far worse. I scrambled to my feet, the fear flooding my veins. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let this city swallow me whole. I turned and ran again, not looking back, knowing that something was hunting me, something far beyond my understanding. And it wasn't going to stop until I was gone. I ran without a clear direction, the streets blurring around me as my feet pounded against the cold concrete. My breath came in quick gasps, a rhythmic pattern that seemed to match the pounding in my chest. My mind raced, but every thought felt fragmented, slipping away before I could grasp it. I had to get out, to find somewhere, anywhere, that felt real, that felt safe. But the more I ran, the more the city seemed to warp around me, like a maze that had no exit, no escape. Every corner I turned led me to another empty street, another silent block. I wanted to scream, to shout for someone, anyone, to hear me. But the only sound was my own footsteps echoing back at me. I paused, trying to catch my breath. My chest ached with each inhale, but I couldn't stop. The figure, the faceless one, it was still in my mind, its cold, lifeless touch burning into my memory. I glanced around. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. No birds, no cars, no voices. Just the wind whispering through the deserted streets, carrying with it a strange, eerie calm. And then, just as I was about to move forward again, I heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible at first, like a distant hum. It was low, rumbling, and unsettling. The noise seemed to be coming from all around me, vibrating through the air, settling deep in my chest. It was like a whisper in the wind, but it wasn't the wind. It was something else. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Was it real? Or was I losing my mind? The hum grew louder, clearer, until it felt like it was surrounding me. I turned, scanning the empty street, searching for the source of the noise. But there was nothing except the empty buildings and the void that stretched out before me. The noise grew louder still, and I realized it wasn't just a hum. It was a voice. A soft, whispering voice, just barely audible, but unmistakable. It seemed to be calling my name. I stiffened, my blood running cold. Was someone out there? Was this another trick, another figment of my tortured mind? The whisper grew louder, more distinct, as if the voice was inching closer, its words more clear now. Come closer, we're waiting for you. I shivered involuntarily, every hair on the back of my neck standing on end. It felt like the voice was inside my head, pressing against my thoughts, pulling me in. My body tensed, fighting the urge to follow it. I shouldn't. I couldn't. But there was something compelling about it, a pull that felt almost magnetic, as if it wasn't just calling me, but summoning me. I took a step back, then another, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But the voice, it was like a thread I couldn't cut, its words weaving into my consciousness, wrapping around my mind. I spun around, unable to stop myself, and ran towards the source. The sound grew louder, but it was no longer just a voice. There was something else mixed in with it, a clicking sound, sharp and rhythmic. Like the sound of something skittering, moving fast, just behind me, almost in sync with my steps. My heart raced as I pushed myself faster, my breath hitching in panic. The voice had become almost too clear, too familiar. It was no longer just calling my name, it was telling me what to do. Come closer, you'll be one of us. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the words echoed in my ears. One of us. The phrase repeated itself, and it suddenly struck me, this wasn't just a voice. It was a warning. A promise. An invitation into something I didn't understand, something that had already claimed this city and, perhaps, its people. The clicking noise grew louder, closer. I could hear it clearly now, like claws tapping against the pavement, fast and erratic. It was right behind me. I dared not look back. A burst of adrenaline shot through me, and I surged forward, running as fast as I could. My legs screamed in protest, but I ignored them, pushing through the pain. The sounds behind me were relentless, the clicks turning into harsh, jagged breaths that echoed in the silent streets. It felt like I wasn't alone, like something was right there, keeping pace with me, watching me, waiting. I rounded a corner, my mind a frantic mess. My heart was slamming in my chest, and I could taste the metallic bitterness of fear in my mouth. The street ahead seemed familiar. It was the same stretch of road I had been down before, but this time something was different. The buildings loomed higher, darker. The windows, once empty, now had shapes behind them. Shadows. Figures that seemed to move as I passed, just out of my line of sight. I slowed, my breath ragged as I tried to make sense of the images. There, just beyond the windows, were faces. Faceless faces staring out at me. They weren't human. They weren't alive. Their expressions were hollow, their features empty, just like the thing I had seen earlier. They all turned toward me at once, their eyes following my every move. I stopped in my tracks, my heart sinking. They were waiting for me to come closer. I had to run. I had to get away. But as I turned to flee, I realized something even more terrifying. I had nowhere left to go. The city, the streets, everything had closed in around me. The buildings seemed to stretch higher, the alleyways narrowing until I was trapped. I couldn't escape. The walls of the city seemed to press in on me from all sides, suffocating me with their cold, silent weight. I turned in every direction, searching for a way out, but the streets were a labyrinth. The familiar landmarks had disappeared, replaced by endless, featureless rows of buildings that stretched into an impenetrable horizon. I was trapped. My breath quickened, my thoughts scattered. The faces, those hollow, lifeless faces in the windows, they were still there, watching, their empty eyes fixed on me as if they knew something I didn't. Their expressions never changed, but there was a sense of expectation in the air, a heavy, oppressive pressure that made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, but the silence was too absolute, too suffocating. No sound could escape. No one could hear me. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. The city, once familiar, had become a trap, an eerie, inescapable prison. And the worst part was that I wasn't alone. The clicking noise was back. Louder now. It wasn't just behind me, it was all around me, as if the very air was thick with it. My heart hammered in my chest, and I spun around, my eyes searching frantically for the source. The streets remained empty. The windows still held those faceless figures, their gaze unwavering. Yet the clicking continued, sharp and erratic, like the scuttling of something small but relentless. It was getting closer. I could feel it. Something, or someone, was moving in the shadows, just out of my sight. The clicking grew faster, more intense, until it felt like a heartbeat, like the pulse of the city itself. I forced myself to take a step forward, my legs trembling beneath me. The streets felt like a dream, warped and twisted, as if the very ground beneath me was shifting. Every time I thought I saw a way out, the path would change, the road bending impossibly, leading me in circles. There was no escape. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw something ahead, a break in the monotony of the city. A door. It was small, almost hidden between two towering buildings, but it stood out against the emptiness. I didn't hesitate. I ran towards it, my feet pounding the pavement, the clicking sounds echoing in my ears, urging me forward. I reached the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and I felt a surge of dread rise in my chest. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't stay out here in the open, not with whatever was behind me. I pushed the door open. It was dark inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. The moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound deafening in the silence. I spun around, panic rising in my throat, but the door was gone. No handle, no hinges, just a blank wall where it had been. I was trapped again. I took a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. This was it, then. This was the end. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized something even worse. I wasn't alone here either. There were shapes in the dark. Figures. They stood motionless at the edges of my vision, barely distinguishable in the low light. But I could feel their presence. Their eyes, though I couldn't see them, seemed to be trained on me, watching me, waiting. The clicking sound was gone, replaced by a low, unsettling hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It wasn't the wind or the city. It was coming from within the building, from them. I knew it. I took a step forward, my feet slow, hesitant. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run, but there was nowhere to run. There was nothing but the dark and the figures that stood motionless in the corners. I couldn't see their faces, but I could feel them, their gaze burning through the darkness. Each breath I took felt like it was being watched. Wait. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to have come inside. But I had no choice. I forced myself to move forward, my legs trembling with each step. The closer I got to the center of the room, the heavier the air became, thick with something I couldn't explain. My mind screamed for answers, but there were none. And then, just as I reached the middle of the room, the hum stopped. The silence returned. But it was different this time. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of something that wasn't right. I could feel it now, all around me. The presence of something ancient, something that had been here long before I had ever arrived. The city wasn't empty. It wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, and found myself face to face with the thing that had been following me all along. It was not a person. It had no face, no form, just a silhouette. It was the same as the figure I had seen in the street, the one I had been running from. But this time, there was no doubt. It was here, in front of me, and it was waiting for me. The darkness pressed in, the air thickening as the figure stepped closer. I backed away, my legs weak, my breath coming in shallow gasps. But there was nowhere to go. The room had closed in around me. The figure reached out, and I felt a cold, clammy hand on my arm. I screamed, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, my body frozen in place. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then, the figure spoke. But it wasn't with words. It was with thoughts, mine. You shouldn't have come here. The whispering voice echoed in my mind, a deep, hollow presence that reverberated through my skull. I could feel it, feel the weight of it, pressing against me. I wanted to scream again, to fight, but it was no use. I had already lost. The cold hand gripped my arm tighter, dragging me closer to the figure that stood before me, its outline now sharper, clearer in the darkness. It had no face, nothing human about it at all. Yet, I knew its presence as surely as I knew my own breath. Its very being radiated a silent command, a force I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I struggled. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls bending inward, as if the very building was alive, its pulse synced with the strange, alien hum that had returned. My mind raced. What was it? What was happening? The figure's hand tightened further, and I felt my body grow heavier. The weight wasn't physical, it was something deeper, something that dug into my very soul, like it was pulling the essence of who I was from me. You shouldn't have come here, the voice echoed again, this time not only in my mind but in the air around me, as though it surrounded me, wrapping me in its oppressive grip. The words weren't just spoken, they felt like a command, a warning, as though I had trespassed in a realm where I didn't belong. I tried to scream, but the sound never reached my throat. My mouth was dry, my body paralyzed. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The darkness was swallowing me whole, and every part of me knew this was the end. But then, just as I felt myself slipping into that endless void, something shifted. The figure began to fade. Not physically, but its presence, the heavy weight it carried, began to dissolve into the air. The hum started to distort, warping and distending like it was being twisted into something unrecognizable. I felt a sudden pull, like gravity had reversed itself. My feet left the ground, and the air around me seemed to rush past, a blur of shifting shadows. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't tell if I was falling or rising. I couldn't tell where I was anymore. And then, in an instant, the world stopped. The pressure lifted, the dark shadows receded, and I was left standing in a different place. The room was gone, replaced by a vast expanse of nothingness. No walls. No ceiling. Just an infinite, empty space stretching in all directions. My heart raced, and I gasped for air, but it was as if there was no air to breathe. The silence was deafening, more suffocating than the void I had just escaped. I was alone. Was I alone? My thoughts echoed back at me, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something in the distance. A flicker of movement, a shape that seemed to vanish before I could focus on it. I turned, heart hammering in my chest, trying to locate the source of the movement. There was nothing. Just endless emptiness. But that flicker stayed with me, lingering in the corner of my mind, like a memory I couldn't reach. I felt myself growing weaker. My limbs were heavy, my vision clouding. My mind swam with fragmented thoughts. Had I been here before? Was this the same place I had been? The city? No, this was different. This was something else. A place between places, a place that shouldn't exist. I staggered forward, unsure of what direction I was heading. The ground felt solid beneath my feet, but I couldn't see it. I couldn't see anything. Only that shadow, the lingering presence, hanging in the corner of my mind, watching. It came to me then, in a flash, the city. The people. The figures. It was all connected. The city hadn't disappeared. It was never empty. It was here, in this endless place. The faces I had seen were reflections of the past. They were part of this, part of whatever had claimed the city, whatever had claimed me. I wasn't free. I hadn't escaped. I had been pulled into something far worse than I could ever understand. The city, the figures, the silence, it was all a trap, a prison for those who dared to enter, and now I was part of it. And they were waiting for me. I froze, the weight of that realization crashing over me like a wave. The shape from the distance, that flicker, had never disappeared. It was approaching. I could feel its presence again, the same suffocating pull. It was coming for me. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't run. The hum returned, but this time it wasn't distant. It was inside my mind, vibrating my thoughts, tearing at the edges of my consciousness. The figure was closer now, so close I could feel its coldness, like the last breath of the city itself. And then, the figure spoke again, its voice not a whisper but a thunderous roar that reverberated through the empty space. "You shouldn't have come here," it said again, the words sinking into my very being. The echo twisted and stretched until it was no longer just a warning but a curse. With that final, crushing declaration, I felt myself begin to fade, not physically, but something deeper, something that reached beyond the body. I was losing myself, dissolving into the darkness, becoming one with the emptiness that had claimed the city. And as the last remnants of my consciousness slipped away, one thought remained, a cold, chilling truth that burned in my mind. There is no escape. The morning seemed like any other. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting long streaks of light across the living room. I was half awake, still tangled in the warmth of my blanket, when the sound of the mailbox slamming shut outside caught my attention. I stretched, yawning, and swung my legs off the couch, my bare feet brushing against the cold wooden floor. The scent of coffee brewing from the kitchen made its way through the air, filling my senses with comfort. But as I walked toward the door, something felt different. A faint unease settled in my chest, as if something unseen was waiting. Something about today wasn't right. I opened the door, and there it was, an envelope sitting neatly in the mailbox. A small detail that normally wouldn't have caught my attention, but today it did. It was addressed to me in my handwriting. I blinked, unsure if I was seeing things clearly. I didn't write this. The envelope looked ordinary, plain even, with no markings besides my name scrawled in ink. I turned it over, my heart thumping in my chest as I noticed the date written across the flap. It was from the future, dated for 1 year from today. I froze, the world around me suddenly feeling a little too quiet, a little too still. There was no mistaking it. The date on the letter was exactly 1 year ahead. My name, written in the same penmanship I used every day, was unmistakable. But how could this be? How could an envelope from my future exist in my mailbox? I stood there for a long time, unsure of what to do next. My mind raced, questions piling up, all leading to one overwhelming thought: this was impossible. What was the purpose of the letter? Was it a prank? But it didn't feel like one. There was something about it, an undeniable weight, an ominous feeling that made my stomach churn. I didn't even know if I wanted to open it. The more I stared at it, the more it felt like it was calling to me, a magnetic pull I couldn't explain. I shook my head, trying to push away the unease, but I couldn't fight the growing curiosity. I broke the seal. My fingers were trembling slightly as I pulled the letter out, unfolded it, and began to read. The handwriting on the paper was familiar, yet distant, almost as if it wasn't mine but something I had once written long ago. The ink was clear, the words deliberate. The letter began with my name, followed by a warning. You must not open this letter before the date printed on the front. Trust me. I know you won't believe me, but you have to. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Why had I written this? It didn't make sense. The letter continued. The world as you know it will change. There is no escaping what's coming. You won't be able to stop it, but you can prepare. This letter is the first of many. Don't tell anyone about it. And don't trust anyone who asks. I read the words over and over, each time the terror inside me growing deeper. What was coming? The letter offered no clear explanation, only cryptic hints. It felt like a warning about something I wasn't ready to face. The last line was the one that sent a chill through me. By the time you read this, it will already be too late. I stood frozen, staring at the words, the weight of them settling on me like a thick, suffocating fog. My thoughts spiraled out of control. I had to know more. I had to understand what was going on. But deep down, a part of me wished I had never opened the letter, never seen the words. The envelope crinkled in my hand as I clutched it tightly, my mind racing. What could this mean? What did it all lead to? I looked around the room, feeling like I was being watched, like something unseen was lurking just out of view. I could almost hear my own breath, shallow and erratic, echoing in the silent space. The air was too thick with tension, the atmosphere too heavy. What did I do? That's when I noticed the clock on the wall. The time had changed. The hands were pointing to the time they should have been. No, it was as if they had jumped ahead by an hour. I blinked, and the world seemed to warp just a little. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this way, but it was getting worse. I looked back down at the letter in my hand, and in a sickening moment of clarity, I realized something. The date on the letter, what if it was never meant to be the future, but the past? I wasn't just holding a message from tomorrow. I was holding a warning from someone who already knew the outcome. The future wasn't a place ahead of me, it was a place I was already falling into. But what did it mean? I stood there for a long time, staring at the letter as if it might answer my questions on its own. The words on the paper seemed to pulse, almost as if they were alive, reminding me that I had already made a choice by opening it. My thoughts raced, but they felt disjointed, like fragments of a dream I couldn't quite grasp. The letter's warning echoed in my mind. You must not open this letter before the date printed on the front. Trust me. I know you won't believe me, but you have to. But what if I was already too late? What if the letter had already predicted my every move? The clock on the wall ticked loudly, its hands shifting slowly but steadily forward, almost as if it were mocking me. I glanced nervously at the window, expecting the world outside to feel different, to have changed in some way. But nothing had changed, nothing tangible. The same trees swayed in the wind, the same houses lined the street, and the same empty roads stretched out before me. Yet, there was something off. Something I couldn't quite place. I stepped back inside, my feet moving on autopilot, my mind lost in a haze of confusion. The letter was still clutched tightly in my hand, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. More that I needed to understand. I tried to distract myself by doing something mundane. The smell of coffee in the kitchen was comforting, so I moved to make a cup. I thought, maybe if I just focus on something else for a moment, the anxiety will pass. I'll figure this out later. But as I poured the coffee, I noticed something strange in the reflection of the kitchen window. The street outside, which should have been quiet and empty, was suddenly crowded. Figures were moving in the distance, people I didn't recognize, people who weren't there before. I turned quickly to the window, but the street was empty again, as if the figures had never been there. My heart raced. I blinked, convinced my mind was playing tricks on me. The coffee cup trembled in my hands. Was I imagining things? I stepped back, feeling dizzy. The letter, what if it had something to do with this? I couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that was settling in my chest. The city felt like it was holding its breath, as if it, too, was waiting for something. My phone buzzed, a sudden jolt in the silence. I glanced at the screen, but the message was nothing more than an ordinary text from a friend asking if I was free later. But I had the strangest feeling that something was off with the phone too. The text wasn't quite right, something about it felt wrong. I opened the message. It was from the future, another message from myself, just like the letter. You'll start to notice things soon. Things out of place. People you don't recognize, things you can't explain. Don't trust them. Don't trust anything. My blood ran cold. I looked at the clock again, but the hands had moved yet another hour forward. I could feel it now, a shift in the air. A palpable change, as if the world was shifting and bending around me, pulling me deeper into something I wasn't prepared for. The message seemed to mock me as I read it again, realizing the warning had become more real with every passing second. You won't believe me, but you have to. I felt a pressure building in my chest, suffocating me. What was happening? Was the letter, the message, the strange figures in the window, all of it part of the same warning? Or was this all part of something worse? And then, for the first time, I heard it. A knock. Soft, deliberate, on the front door. It was so quiet, so faint, that at first I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, 3 knocks, followed by a pause, then 3 more. A rhythm I couldn't ignore. I stood frozen. My heart pounded in my chest. Who could it be? No one had come to visit. No one had ever knocked like that. But somehow, I knew that the answer was waiting for me beyond that door. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved of their own accord, dragging me forward, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. What was I about to face? Would it be someone from the future? Someone who knew what was going to happen next. The moment I touched the door, the air seemed to thicken, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Every instinct screamed at me to turn away, to run, but I opened the door anyway. There was no one there. But the instant I looked out, a piece of paper fluttered from above and landed at my feet. I bent down slowly, my stomach churning with dread. I picked it up, and when I saw the date at the top of the page, my blood ran cold. It was the same date as the one on the letter. The message inside read, "It's already started. Don't let them catch you." I looked up, my heart racing. I was no longer alone. Someone was watching me. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in short, panic bursts. The paper crinkled in my hand, its ominous message sinking deeper into my mind. Don't let them catch you. The words repeated over and over in my head, like a chant that wouldn't stop, an alarm I couldn't silence. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room. The house had never felt so empty, so silent. The quiet was suffocating, oppressive, as though the world itself had stopped turning. And then another knock. This time it came from the back door. I froze. The knock wasn't soft this time. It was urgent, loud, and sharp, like it was demanding attention. 3 knocks, just like before. But this time, there was no pause between them. I had to make a choice. I knew I couldn't stay in the house. But where could I go? If this was truly a warning, if something was out there, someone, was I safe anywhere? I felt my stomach twist into a tight knot. I took a step toward the back door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The sensation of being watched didn't let up. It felt like something was breathing just behind me, its presence so close, yet I couldn't see it. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to find a figure standing in the hallway. But there was nothing. Only shadows. The door creaked open slowly, and I stepped out into the cold air, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread pressing down on me. The street outside was eerily still, the usual hum of distant traffic completely absent. No one was around. No cars, no pedestrians, nothing. But the feeling of being watched intensified. Every hair on my neck stood on end. My legs were frozen to the spot, unwilling to move forward, yet I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to find out what was going on, even if it meant confronting whatever was behind these strange occurrences. I walked quickly, trying to ignore the gnawing fear clawing at my mind. My thoughts swirled in a mess of confusion and panic. What was this? Why was it happening to me? I reached the park at the end of my block. Normally, this place was filled with people, children playing, families walking their dogs. But today, it was silent. No sound except the rustle of dry leaves blowing across the ground. A few trees stood tall, their branches bare and reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. I should have turned back. I should have run. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was here. That somehow, the key to everything was just out of reach. And then, I saw it. A figure standing near the park's entrance, half hidden in the shadows. It was so still, so unnatural, that for a moment I thought it might be a trick of the light. But no, it was real. The figure was tall, its shape indistinct, as though it was made of shadows themselves, blending into the surroundings. I couldn't make out any details, no face, no distinguishing features. Just a silhouette, watching me. My heart raced in my chest, my hands trembling so violently that the paper in my pocket crinkled like it was about to tear. Was this one of them? The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its presence filling the air with a thick sense of unease. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, my mind fighting against the overwhelming desire to flee. The silence between us stretched on, the only sound the wind in the trees and the frantic beating of my heart. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this person from the future? Or was this something far worse? The figure tilted its head slightly, as if noticing my fear, acknowledging it. And then, slowly, it began to move toward me. The air seemed to grow colder with every step it took, as if the temperature dropped by degrees with its approach. I could feel my breath fogging in front of me, my hands numb from the chill. Suddenly, there was a sharp sound, like a crack of thunder, but it wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from the figure. A low, guttural noise filled the air, a sound that was neither human nor animal, but something in between. It rattled my bones, making me feel sick to my stomach. Don't let them catch you. The words from the letter rang in my head. And for the first time, I understood what they meant. The thing in front of me wasn't just a person. It wasn't even human. It was something else, something ancient, something that had no place here. And it was coming for me. I turned and ran, my legs moving on their own, propelled by sheer terror. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat louder than the last, as I sprinted down the empty street. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel the presence behind me, getting closer, closer. The world around me began to blur as panic set in. The sound of my footsteps echoed in my ears, but the knocking that had started all of this, seemed to follow me. 3 knocks. Another pause. 3 more. I didn't look back. I couldn't. And then, as I rounded the corner, I saw the impossible. A shadow, large and looming, stretched across the sidewalk in front of me. It wasn't a person, it wasn't a figure, it was an entity, something that couldn't exist in the natural world. And it was waiting for me. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The street had never seemed so empty, and yet I wasn't alone. The thing in front of me wasn't just watching, it was waiting. And whatever it was, it knew exactly what I was going to do next. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The letter, the message, the knocking, it had all led to this moment. Everything I had done, every step I had taken, was part of a path I could never escape. I had been caught. The shadow before me grew taller, the outline stretching unnaturally across the sidewalk. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak, my chest tight with fear. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything, but my body refused to obey. I could only watch as the creature in front of me moved, its steps soundless, its form distorting with each passing second. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could understand. The shadows seemed to bend the very air around it, twisting reality itself. Its presence filled every corner of my vision, blocking out the world around me until it was the only thing left. And then it spoke. The voice was not a voice at all. It was a series of cold whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't a language I knew, yet somehow I understood its meaning. You cannot escape. You are part of the cycle. The words echoed in my mind, the cold, alien certainty in them paralyzing me even further. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body remained locked in place. The thing wasn't speaking to me in a way that made sense. It wasn't trying to communicate, no, it was asserting its will, telling me that everything I had done was futile. I had no choice. The whispers grew louder, and the shadow surged forward in a blur of darkness, engulfing me. The last thing I saw was its empty, hollow shape, expanding and folding in on itself, until I was consumed by it entirely. For a moment, there was nothing but blackness. The world seemed to cease. I was suspended in a place that had no beginning, no end. Time no longer had meaning. I felt like I was drifting, floating in an endless abyss. Then, in a sudden, sharp moment, reality crashed back in. I was lying on the cold, wet pavement, gasping for air. The sound of my breath echoed in the emptiness around me, and I slowly pushed myself up, my hands trembling as they scraped against the rough ground. I blinked rapidly, trying to focus. The world around me was completely still. I looked up, my heart sinking into my stomach. The street was just as empty as before. No cars, no people, no sound. The silence was even more oppressive now, as though the air itself was suffocating. But then my eyes fell on something familiar. My house. The very house I had tried to escape from. It stood in the distance, but there was no mistaking it. It was the same. A wave of realization washed over me. I was no longer in the present. I had traveled, been pulled somewhere else. I stood up, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle on my shoulders. The letter. The knocks. The shadow. I had thought I was running from whatever force was after me, but it was clear now that it wasn't after me at all. It had already found me. I wasn't just trapped in a moment. I had slipped into a place where time didn't exist, a place where everything had already happened and everything would happen again. I was stuck in a loop. And the worst part? It would never end. No matter how many times I tried, no matter how many times I ran, I was destined to repeat this nightmare over and over. The knocking would always come, the letter would always arrive, and I would always end up facing that thing in the park. There was no escape. The whispering voices returned in my mind, soft but insistent, like the wind in the trees. You are part of the cycle. And then, just as I thought I might lose my grip on reality completely, a new voice emerged from the chaos. A voice that sounded so much like mine, yet not. You've been here before. Haven't you? The words sent a shiver down my spine. And just like that, the cycle began again. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.